There is a kind of peace that doesn't ask your permission. You didn't choose it. You didn't earn it. One moment, you were running lists, unfinished, thoughts circling, the day still clinging to your shoulders, and then something shifted. A breath, the weight of the blanket, the way the room grew quiet, without you doing anything at all. That peace, the kind that was already here. Tonight's stories come from that place, not the peace you manufacture, through effort or willpower or getting everything right. Not the peace that arrives only after problems are solved and worries disappear and the mind finally stops. That peace is always just out of reach, and that is why it exhausts you. No, these are stories of wild peace. Untamed, unforced, organic. The kind the ancient masters found, not by stilling the storm, but by discovering something underneath the storm that was never disturbed. A stillness that doesn't need quiet to exist. A rest that doesn't need the mind to cooperate. Across 10 journeys tonight, you'll travel into Korean mountain hermitages, where monks sat with the howling wind, until the wind became their own breath. You'll walk beside a Vietnamese emperor who discovered that the throne and the bamboo grove were, in the end, the same place. You'll sit with Theravada forest masters who stopped wrestling with sleep and let the night do what nights do. You'll find Chinese Chan teachers who answered questions about peace by pouring tea and saying nothing. Tibetan yogis, Japanese farmers, Burmese fishermen standing still in the rain. These stories are offered as contemplative reflection, inspired by Buddhist wisdom gathered across centuries of Asian spiritual life for rest and gentle companionship at the end of your day. They are not medicine. They are not instruction. They are windows, gently opened. Let the shoulders drop a little. Feel where the body meets the bed. You don't need to hold anything up right now. If you drift while listening, that is not failure. That is the point. The first story begins now, in a valley in 13th century Korea, where a monk had been fighting for peace so long, he had forgotten what he was fighting for. In the spring of the year 1198, a monk named Jinul climbed alone into the high country of Mount Jirisan, carrying almost nothing. He had a sleeping mat, rolled and strapped across his back, a single change of grey hemp robes, the kind worn by Korean Seon monks undyed, rough to the touch, smelling faintly of the cedar chest where it had been stored through winter, a clay bowl, a small knife for cutting greens, 2 cotton pouches of dried barley rice, the record of Dahui Zongao, wrapped in oiled cloth against the mountain weather, and a mind full of questions that 39 years of living and 24 years of practice had so far failed to quiet. He had left behind the comfortable weight of reputation. He had been, by that point, a respected teacher, a man whose name moved through the monasteries of Goryeo like smoke through temple halls, slow and persistent and impossible to ignore. Students had gathered around him, abbots had deferred to him, a king had taken notice, prominent patrons sent offerings. Younger monks watched the way he walked from the meditation hall to the kitchen, as though the manner of his walking contained instruction. All of it, every grain of that recognition, had begun to feel like a coat he was wearing in summer. Heavier each year, warmer than he needed, impossible to take off without explaining why. The hermitage he was climbing toward was called Sangmujuam. It sat on a northern spur of Jirisan, high above the valleys where farmers were already turning their spring soil, already calculating yields, already worrying about rain. It was a small hermitage, very old, built according to those who knew such things during the early Silla period, though most of the original structure had long since rotted and been replaced with rougher materials by monks whose names no one had recorded. From its single south-facing window, on clear days, you could see the Seomjingang River far below, a silver thread through green agricultural lowlands, and beyond that, the ridge folding further south toward the sea. On cloudy days, which were most days in spring, you could see nothing but white, a white so complete and unhurried that it felt less like weather and more like the mountain's own mind. The path up from the last village was steep and poorly maintained. Loose stones slid underfoot, and the pine roots that crossed the trail at intervals were slicked with morning moisture from the mist that hung in the gullies. The air held the particular smell of Korean mountain spring cold earth, releasing its winter, the sharp sweetness of new pine growth, the damp musk of old leaves softening back into soil, and underneath it all, water, everywhere water, running down in thin bright threads from the snowmelt higher up, collecting in pools that caught the grey morning light and held it briefly, quivering, before releasing it downstream. Jinul climbed slowly. He was not in poor health, but he was also not in a hurry. He had arranged, in his meat, to stay at the hermitage for 3 years, and 3 years was enough time to arrive without rushing. He paused several times once to watch a pair of grey herons crossing the valley below in a wide, unhurried arc, once because a branch beside the path held a spider's web still dense with overnight dew, each thread carrying so many water drops that the whole construction had grown heavy and begun to sag in long glittering arcs. And he stood looking at it for a while, without knowing exactly why, once simply because his legs were tired and the view down into the valley was worth stopping for. What he did not tell anyone, not even the young monk Yesim, who had carried his pack to the trailhead and stood looking up the mountain with an expression that mixed reverence and worry in equal measure, was why he was really going. The reason he gave was rest, a period of solitary practice, withdrawal from the pressures of administration. All of this was true. None of it was the whole truth. The whole truth was this: Jinul had not yet found what he was looking for, and after 24 years of sincere, sustained, intelligent practice, that fact had become quietly unbearable. He had left his family at 15, the son of a government official in what was then a prosperous celadon-making, temple-building era of Goryeo. His father had imagined a future for him involving silk robes and court positions and the kind of measured, respected life that the Goryeo elite considered the highest form of existence. Jinul had looked at that future with the polite detachment of a boy who has already decided, without being able to explain why, that it belonged to someone else. He received ordination from Seon Master Jongwi of the Sagulsan Mountain School, one of the 9 mountain schools that formed the backbone of Korean Seon. At 24, he passed the royal examination for monks, a national examination, competitive and serious, a gateway to the highest administrative positions in the Buddhist community, the kind of positions that came with comfortable quarters and significant influence and the gratitude of kings. He passed the examination and then, to the confusion and mild scandal of everyone present, declined every appointment it offered and left for a remote temple in Pyongyang to attend a Seon assembly. At that assembly, he had his first real glimpse. He was reading the Platform Sutra of the 6th Patriarch Huneng, the illiterate woodcutter who became the most influential figure in Chan Buddhism, and came across a passage about the nature of original mind. Something in his chest opened. Briefly, not dramatically, not with visions or tears or the sense of arriving somewhere new, more like a window opened in a room that had been closed for too long. And the air that came through was not foreign, it was simply the same air, recognized. He tried to form a retreat community then and there, gathered monks around the idea, and watched it dissolve before it properly began. He moved to a different temple. He read the Avatamsaka Sutra for 3 years, all of it, every word, and found a second opening, deeper than the first, in a passage describing the appearance of the Tathagatas. He gathered monks again. This time the community held. He built it around the twin practices of samadhi and prajna, stillness and wisdom, and watched it grow into something real. Students came from distances that surprised him. He wrote texts that were copied and circulated. He taught. He counseled. He answered questions. He gave talks that left rooms full of monks sitting in silence for a long time after he had finished speaking. And still, running underneath all of it, like cold water beneath warm ground, was a sense he could not resolve, a sense that he was manufacturing something rather than finding something. That peace, when it came during his practice, was assembled rather than inherent, that he was still, at some level, too fundamental to easily address, working at this rather than resting in it. The hermitage, when he arrived, was smaller than memory had made it. A single room of rough cypress planks, darkened with age to the color of old tea, the grain of the wood raised slightly by years of mountain damp into a texture you could feel through the palm of a hand. The roof had been patched in at least 3 places, using different materials: cedar bark, compressed pine needles, something that appeared to be clay mixed with straw, and the patches were themselves beginning to show their age. There was a stone hearth in one corner, cold and holding the faint ghost of old wood smoke. A sleeping mat rolled against the wall, its rush covering worn thin in the center from years of use by monks whose names were unknown. A low table that listed slightly to the left, as though it had been tired for a very long time and had simply stopped pretending otherwise. On the table, a clay bowl, empty. Inside the bowl, the dry grey remains of incense ash, very old, the shape of whatever stick had burned there, still faintly visible in the grey residue, the way a body leaves an impression in a pillow long after it has risen. Jinul set down his pack. He stood in the center of the room and listened. Wind, high and loose, moving through the pine canopy with no particular urgency, a sound like someone breathing slowly in the next room, present, rhythmic, indifferent to whether you heard it or not. Somewhere outside and below, a stream, small and persistent, its voice changing pitch as the wind shifted, now lower, now brighter. The creak of the hermitage itself, the old wood adjusting to his weight and warmth, the way a house does when it has been empty for some time and a person comes back to it. A smell, cold stone, old pineresin, the faint sweetness of earth that had been covered all winter and was now beginning, slowly, to breathe. He sat down on the mat without unpacking, without arranging anything, without unrolling his own bedding or finding the hearth tools or organizing the food he had carried up. He sat down cross-legged, rested his hands in his lap, and thought, as clearly and simply as he had thought anything in years, I will stop trying to get somewhere else. The first weeks were difficult in the specific way that honesty is difficult. Without the comforting structure of the retreat community, the bells marking each hour, the communal meals where rice was eaten in prescribed silence, the students whose questions kept his mind productively occupied, and his sense of himself as a teacher comfortably intact. There was nothing between Jinul and the bare quality of his own experience. No one to perform equanimity for, no one to reassure with the spectacle of his calm. Just the room, the mountain, the breath, and whatever was actually happening inside him. What was happening, he discovered, in those first weeks, was considerable agitation. Not the dramatic kind, not despair, or grief, or the spectacular crises that appear in certain Enlightenment biographies as proof of depth. Smaller and more persistent than that. A background hum of resistance. The way a lute string holds tension even when no one is playing it. He sat in the mornings until the light changed from grey-white to amber through the paper screen, and he watched the agitation without engaging it. And it did not stop. He walked the short circuit around the hermitage in the afternoons, down to where the stream bent around a granite outcropping and back. Perhaps 300 steps each way, and the agitation walked with him. Patient and unconcerned, he ate his barley rice. Supplemented by wild spring greens, he gathered along the stream bank. Fiddlehead ferns still tightly curled, young bracken, the slightly bitter leaves of something that grew in the cracks of the granite, and that he had learned, in earlier mountain retreats, was edible. He drank pine needle tea, steeped until it turned the color of pale jade. He slept when it was dark. He sat when it was light. He read, in the evenings, the record of Dahui Zonggao. Master Dahui had been a Chinese Chan teacher of the previous century, not gentle, not particularly patient, famous for burning the printed woodblocks of the Bianlu collection because he felt his students had begun to use the text as a substitute for actual practice. His record was correspondingly blunt. He wrote with the directness of a man who had stopped managing how he was perceived, and some of what he wrote had always unsettled Jinul in a way that useful things do a slight discomfort at the center. The feeling of a splinter you had almost, but not quite located. One evening, in his third week at the hermitage, the mountain wind had worked itself into a higher and more insistent register outside. The paper screen at the window bowed slightly inward with each gust. The single oil lamp threw shadows that moved and settled. Jinul was reading, his bowl of pine needle tea cooling beside him, his back straight from habit, the pages of the record open on the low table that listed to the left. He came to a passage he had read before. He had read it carefully, perhaps a dozen times, with the full apparatus of his considerable intelligence applied to it. He had understood it. He had been able to explain it to others. He had, in fact, used it in his own teachings, paraphrased it skillfully, watched younger monks receive it with the widened eyes that indicated something had been heard. The passage said, in the particular way Dahui said such things, the mind that seeks peace and the peace it seeks are not two different things. He read it again, and then, for no reason that he could identify afterward, no dramatic event, no tremor in the earth, no visitation, no technique coming to fruition, the sentence did what it said. Not because he finally understood it correctly, not because his practice had finally matured to the point where understanding was possible, but the way a knot releases when the tension that was holding it tight is suddenly, for no particular reason, no longer being applied. The seeking stopped, not because it was suppressed, not because he had become skillful enough to stop it. It stopped the way a wave stops being a wave when it reaches the shore, not with loss, not with violence, but with a kind of completion, a return. The wave had always been the ocean, It had never been anything else. The reaching had always been resting. There had never been anywhere to reach to. Jinul sat without moving for a long time. The lamp burned. The wind moved the shadow of the window frame slowly across the floor. The tea went cold. Outside, the stream continued its description of its own nature, which was simply to move where the ground allowed, without preference for any particular direction. He was not calm. This is important to say clearly. He was not in a state of achieved calm, the kind that required maintenance, the kind that arrived when conditions were favorable and departed when they were not. He was something prior to both calm and disturbance, something that had not been made and therefore could not be unmade. He would later describe it as discovering that the house you had been trying to build had been standing around you the entire time. You had been so absorbed in the construction that you had never paused to look up. He began, after some time, to cry, not from grief, not precisely from relief, though relief was present, warm and disorienting. He cried from a kind of tenderness toward himself, toward the 24 years of sincere, dedicated, completely unnecessary effort, toward the boy of 15 who had left his father's house and the silk merchant's world and the arranged future, carrying a hunger for something he could not name, and had spent a quarter century searching with enormous intelligence and devotion in every text and teaching and practice he could find for something that had been present in him before he took his first step away from home. Not absent, not hidden, not requiring achievement or merit or sufficient practice hours. Present, always present. He had been swimming in it the whole time, certain he was in danger of drowning. In the weeks and months that followed, the habits of decades did not simply vanish. The tendency to grip did not disappear overnight. The background hum of effort did not cease all at once, but there was a difference that Jinul would spend the remaining 12 years of his life attempting to describe to others, with great care and limited success and deep compassion for how difficult description was. The difference was this: before, he had been practicing toward peace. After, he was practicing from peace. The effort was the same effort. The sitting was the same sitting. The walking and the eating and the studying were identical in form, but they arose from a different ground. Not from a lack that needed filling, but from a fullness that wanted to move. He completed his 3 years at Sangmujuam. He came back down the mountain in the year 1200, settled at a temple on Mount Songwangsan, which a grateful king would later rename Jogisan in his honor, and taught for the rest of his life. He founded the community that would become Songwangsa, the great monastery that still stands today in the mountains of South Jeolla province, surrounded by pine trees and crossed by streams that have been moving through those valleys since before anyone was there to hear them. He became national teacher of Goryeo. He guided hundreds of monks and wrote texts that are still studied, and in all of it, he never claimed to have found peace. He claimed only to have recognized what had always been there. There is something in this story that belongs to tonight. Not the extraordinary part, not the 24 years of rigorous Korean monastic practice, not the royal examinations, or the retreat communities, or the mountain hermitage. That was Jinul's particular path, and it was his alone. But the recognition itself, the moment when the seeking released, not because it was resolved, but because it was no longer needed. That moment does not require a hermitage. It does not require 24 years, or 3 years, or 3 weeks. It requires only what you are already doing right now, lying still, breathing, letting the day be finished, The day is finished. You were in it for the whole of it, and now it is done. The thoughts that are still moving are not the day continuing. They are the mind's habit of movement, like the flame of a lamp still flickering after the oil is nearly gone. They are not problems. They are not things to solve or finish or figure out before you are permitted to sleep. They are simply the mind doing what minds do in the last country between waking and sleep. You don't need to still them. Jinul sat with his agitation for 3 weeks, and it did not prevent the recognition. Your thoughts tonight will not prevent your rest. What you might notice, if you allow yourself to look very gently, with no urgency, is that underneath the thoughts, there is something that is not a thought, a quality of awareness that is simply present, not manufactured, not depending on the thoughts being any particular way. The way the stream continued under the hermitage, regardless of whether Jinul was peaceful or agitated, whether the lamp was lit or dark, whether the wind was high or still. The stream was just the stream. It had no interest in his progress. Your awareness tonight is just awareness. It was here before you were tired. It will be here after you fall asleep. Right now, it is here quiet, unhurried, requiring nothing from you. The peace you have been looking for is not at the end of the thoughts. It is not waiting on the other side of enough effort. It is the ground you are lying on, the breath moving in the body right now, the simple, unchanged fact of being present, which you have never stopped being, which no amount of worry or striving has ever actually interrupted. Already here. Already here. Already here. Let the thoughts move if they move. Let the body be exactly as heavy and warm as it is. Let the breath do what the breath does, which is to continue without your guidance, which it has been doing since the first morning of your life and will continue to do through this night without a single moment of your supervision. Jinul came down, the mountain changed and unchanged. The mountain remained the mountain. The stream ran down through the spring valley to the Seom-Jingang River, and from there to the sea, carrying with it nothing and everything, changed at every moment, always itself. And as that understanding settles, that peace is not something you arrive at, but something you are already standing inside, we travel now toward the warm valleys of southern China, where a Chan master was about to answer the oldest question in the world by doing something very ordinary with a cup of water. In the valley below Mount Gonggong in Jiangxi province, in the middle years of the Tang dynasty, there lived a woman who wove silk for a living and could not stop thinking. Her name was Chengling, which meant something like clear spirit in the old poetic style of names her father had favored, though she had never felt particularly clear or particularly spirited. She was 34 years old. Her husband had died of a lung illness 3 winters earlier, leaving her with a loom, a small house with a broken threshold step she kept meaning to repair, 2 mulberry trees in the courtyard, and the particular kind of tiredness that settles into the bones of people who have been carrying weight for a long time without setting it down. She was not poor. Exactly. The silk she wove, plain tabby weave, nothing ornate, the kind of cloth that wealthy merchants in the provincial capital bought in large bolts for lining coats, sold steadily enough to keep rice in the kitchen and the roof repaired when it needed it. She rose before the sky lightened and worked at the loom until the light failed. The rhythm of the shuttle, the soft wooden knock of the beater pressing each new thread into the growing cloth, the way the warp threads parted and closed and parted again as the heddle moved. She knew this rhythm so thoroughly that her hands carried it entirely on their own, leaving her mind free to wander wherever it chose. The problem was that her mind chose badly. It went, habitually, and with great consistency, to worry. Not dramatic worry. She was not the kind of woman who catastrophized or wept easily or lay awake imagining disasters. Her worry was quieter and more persistent than that. It was the worry of a person who has learned to be careful, who checks the rice container every morning to know precisely how much remains, who wakes in the night and lies calculating rice against coin, coin against cloth, cloth against the number of days until the next market. Competent, thorough, low-grade, unceasing worry. The kind that a person can carry for so long, it stops feeling like worry and starts feeling like simply paying attention. She had visited the monastery on Gonggong Mountain once, 7 years earlier, when her husband was still alive and the trip had been a festival outing rather than a search. She remembered the smell of the incense, sandalwood, and something sweeter, benzoin perhaps, and the way the afternoon light fell through the smoke in tilted columns, and the monks moving through the corridors in their grey and brown robes with a quality of unhurriedness that had struck her then as the most exotic thing she had ever seen. Not the statues, not the paintings on the hall walls, not the ritual and the bells, just that unhurriedness. She had thought about it for weeks afterward. Now, in the autumn of her 34th year, she had begun hearing something about the master there. His name was Dao Yi, though people called him by a name that meant something like Ancestor Ma, and by all accounts, he was not the kind of teacher anyone had seen before. He did not stay in the meditation hall, conducting formal retreats. He was more likely to be found in the kitchen courtyard, or the vegetable garden, or simply walking between the buildings with no apparent destination, stopping to speak with monks, and occasionally, it was said, with lay visitors and farmers and travelers who wandered up the mountain without knowing precisely why. What he said to them was strange, ordinary, impossibly simple. People came away from conversations with him looking slightly dazed, the way a person looks when something obvious has been said for the first time. Chengling did not make a plan to visit him. She was not a person who made plans for things that felt uncertain. She simply found, one clear autumn morning, that she had risen earlier than usual, eaten her rice, and begun walking up the mountain path before she had made any decision she was aware of making. The monastery was smaller than she remembered, or perhaps she had grown since, not in size, but in her sense of what large meant. The main hall sat on a broad terrace of worn stone slabs. The courtyard held a single ginkgo tree, very old, its leaves turned entirely gold in the autumn cold, and when the wind moved through it, the sound was papery and light, like someone turning pages in a vast library. 3 monks were sweeping the courtyard with straw brooms, moving in slow arcs, their attention entirely occupied by the small territory of stone before each broom's reach. They did not look up. She stood at the courtyard entrance for a long time, feeling uncertain in the specific way of someone who has arrived somewhere without knowing what they came for. A voice spoke from her left. "You're weaving something." She turned. A man was sitting on the low stone steps of a side building, repairing a sandal with a strip of hemp cord. He was perhaps 60 years old, heavy-set in the way of men who have been physically active for decades, with eyebrows that grew in enthusiastic horizontal lines above eyes that appeared to be fully occupied with the sandal, and also, somehow, entirely attending to her. He did not look like she had imagined a master would look. He looked like a person repairing a sandal. "I am a weaver," she said, slightly confused by the observation. "You're weaving something right now," he said, without looking up from the sandal. even here. She started to say that she had left the loom at home, that she had walked an hour up the mountain, specifically to be away from the loom. Then she stopped. He was right. She had been, even as she stood in the golden courtyard watching the monks sweep, calculating the price of silk thread in the provincial market, wondering if the autumn rains would come early and spoil the mulberry harvest, considering whether the broken threshold step might be causing her to feel poor in some way disproportionate to the actual state of her finances. She had been weaving. The loom was in her chest. "How do I stop?" she asked. He finished tying the hemp cord and set the sandal on the step beside him. Then he looked at her directly for the first time, and she had the disconcerting sensation of being seen by someone who was not surprised by anything they saw. "Tell me," he said, "when you are working at the loom, truly working the shuttle, moving the rhythm in your hands, where is the worry then?" She considered this honestly. "It's there, running underneath." "Is it?" She started to confirm it was, then paused. Actually, she thought about it seriously. When the weaving was going well, when the rhythm had established itself, and her hands knew exactly what to do, and the cloth was emerging properly, thread by thread, consistent, and even was the worry there? Or was it more accurate to say that there was only weaving, that the part of her that worried was, for those stretches, not exactly absent, but not exactly present either, submerged in something that was neither worried nor not worried, but simply engaged? Sometimes, she said slowly, when the work is very even, there's a gap. A gap, he said, where the running calculations stop. Or, I don't notice it. What is in the gap? She tried to find words for it. There was something there. Not nothing. Not blankness or emptiness in the hollow sense. More like the quality of the air in the courtyard right now. The gold light through the ginkgo, the papery sound of the leaves. A kind of sufficiency, as if in that moment, the rice in the container and the state of the threshold step and the price of thread in autumn were simply not relevant, not because they had been solved or forgotten, but because right here, right now, with the shuttle in her hand and the cloth growing true and even, there was somehow enough. Something like, it's enough, she said, not confidently. Just right now, it's enough. He nodded, as though this were a completely unremarkable thing to say. That, he said, is what the way feels like. Not special, not achieved. The ordinary mind, working and resting and noticing, that is the way. She looked at him. But I lose it. The worry comes back. Of course, it will come back 10,000 times. He picked up the sandal and tested the repaired strap with both thumbs, pressing down on it. It held. And 10,000 times the gap will also come back. The gap doesn't go anywhere. The worry passes through it, the way wind passes through this courtyard. The courtyard does not become the wind. She stood with this for a moment. A monk passed across the far end of the courtyard, carrying a bucket of water in each hand, moving with the slightly forward-leaning balance of someone managing an awkward load. She watched him pass through the gate and disappear, and then watched the place where he had been, which was now simply empty courtyard again, as though he had never been there. The ordinary mind, she said, the one that worries and calculates and checks the rice container. That one, he said, is the way, not because it worries, he said carefully, turning the sandal over in his hands, but because underneath the worrying, it is always, already, what it is. Clear, present, not made of worry, even when worry moves through it. The way this courtyard is not made of wind, even on the windiest day. She left the monastery in the late morning and walked back down the mountain path through the autumn light, the ginkgo leaves drifting behind her like small gold coins, the valley opening below as she descended. She did not feel transformed. She did not feel that anything had been solved. The rice container was still where it was, the threshold step still broken, the autumn rains still possibly coming early. But somewhere in the middle of the walk home, without deciding to, she stopped calculating, not because the problems had been solved, not because she had achieved some state beyond worry. She stopped calculating the way a loom stops at the end of the day, not because the work is finished, but because the light is gone and the hands are tired and the cloth will still be there tomorrow. And the body knows this, even when the mind forgets. She sat down on a flat stone beside the path. The valley was very quiet. A hawk turned slowly in the air above the rice paddies far below, riding a thermal that was invisible from where she sat. She breathed. The stone was warm from the afternoon sun. The grass beside the path smelled of something dry and sweet, the particular smell of mountain grass going to seed at the end of summer. A smell she had known her entire life and never stopped to notice. She sat on the warm stone for a long time, doing nothing in particular, being no one in particular, just a woman on a hillside in the light of a clear autumn afternoon, breathing, alive, in possession of a mind that was, at this moment, as ordinary and untroubled and sufficient as the hawk above the paddies, as the grass beside the path, as the cool stone holding her weight without asking anything in return. This story comes from the tradition of Chinese Chan, from the teaching that the great Tang dynasty master Mazu Daoyi gave to everyone who reached his mountain, not the famous students who came looking for dramatic encounters, but the ordinary people, farmers, merchants, women returning from market, monks who had studied 10 years and were still not sure they understood. He said the same thing to all of them, in different words, in different moments. The mind you already have is the mind of the way, not the mind you will have after sufficient practice, not the mind that exists when worry is absent. This mind, now, the ordinary mind, this is, of all the teachings in the whole long history of Chan Buddhism, perhaps the most radical and the most reassuring. Radical because it removes the goal. There is nowhere to get to. The peace you are looking for is not located at the end of a path of improvement. Reassuring because it removes the obstacle. You are not disqualified. Your worrying, calculating, checking, doubting mind is not a sign that you are too far from peace to find it. It is the mind in which peace is already present, already functioning, already available, the way the courtyard is always available, even when the wind is in it. If you notice, right now, that the mind is busy thoughts about tomorrow, thoughts about what went wrong today, thoughts about the weight in your body and whether you will sleep, this is not a problem. This is the ordinary mind, doing what ordinary minds do. And underneath this activity, right now, not after the thoughts stop, not later, the gap, clear, present, ordinary, sufficient. The worry passes through. The mind remains. The calculation passes through. The awareness remains. The to-do list and the half-resolved conversation and the tightness in the shoulders, these pass through. Underneath them, always, the awareness that was never disturbed by any of it. The awareness that is simply here. The awareness that requires no special conditions to be what it already is. Let yourself be ordinary tonight. Let the mind be exactly as busy or as quiet as it is. The busiest mind is still the way. The most worried mind is still the way. Not because worry is wisdom, but because underneath the worry, there is always the courtyard, always the warm stone, always the hawk turning in the clear air above. 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 Just this. Just the breath. Just this moment as it is. If you drift off now, that is the most ordinary thing in the world. Sleep is the ordinary mind resting. Let it rest. And as the weaver's hands remember their rhythm, even in sleep, and as the courtyard holds the wind without being troubled by it, we travel now further south and further back, to the rice terraces of ancient Vietnam, where a king was about to learn that the thing he had spent a lifetime governing was, in the end, something he had never needed to hold. In the year 1299, in the 12th month of the lunar calendar, a man who had once commanded the armies of Dai Viet and defeated the Mongol forces of Kublai Khan twice in a single decade climbed a mountain barefoot in the thin robe of a novice monk, carrying nothing but a wooden staff. His name was Tran Kam. The people of Dai Viet knew him as the Emperor Nhan Tong, but on this particular morning, ascending the stone and root path toward the summit of Yen Tu Mountain, in what is now the province of Quang Ninh, in the far northeast of Vietnam, the mist pressing down from above. The bamboo forest on either side, releasing slow drops of condensed cloud water onto the path. He was simply a man who had finally done what he had wanted to do since he was a young prince, who once slipped away from the palace in the middle of the night and walked into the dark on bare feet to find a monastery, any monastery, before the palace guards caught up with him by morning. He had wanted this for 30 years. He had governed a nation for 15 years. He had led soldiers to battle. He had attended ceremonies in robes so embroidered with gold thread that the fabric was stiff in the morning cold and had to be warmed near a brazier before it could be worn. He had decided 100 times in rooms full of advisors and ministers and petitioning generals the fates of thousands of people he had never met and would never meet. He had been a good king. He had been, by the general agreement of history, a remarkably good king, just brave, thoughtful, possessed of the unusual kingly virtue of knowing when to listen and when to stop talking. And all of it, every silk robe and treaty and campaign victory and carefully worded decree, had felt underneath the competence and the genuine care, somehow beside the point, not meaningless. He was not a man who dismissed the suffering of his people as irrelevant, but beside a point that he could feel pointing towards something he had not yet been allowed to follow. In 1293, he had placed the crown on his son's head and become the retired emperor. For 6 years, he had continued to support his son's governance, leading a military expedition against a border violation, receiving diplomatic delegations from the Yuan dynasty, teaching and practicing Buddhism in palace hermitages at Vu Lam. His Zen teacher, the remarkable Tu Trung Tuong Si, a layman, the elder brother of the great general Tran Hung Dao, a man who had attained deep realization without ever taking monastic vows, had died in 1291, and Nhan Tong had grieved him with the quiet, specific grief of losing the person who has been most honest with you. Now the 6 years of gradual release were complete. His son's reign was stable. The diplomacy was settled. The border was secure, and Tran Hum, who had once been emperor of Dai Viet, and before that had been a boy who ran away from the palace in the night, wanting only to find a place where the mind could be quiet, was climbing a mountain in the pale morning fog. His attendant for this journey was a young man named Bao Dat. Bao Dat had served the retired emperor for 3 years. Since being assigned to his household after a previous attendant was transferred, he was 22 years old, the son of a Mandarin family from Thang-long, raised with the usual combination of classical texts, Confucian propriety, and the particular anxiety of people born into a class that requires perpetual demonstration of worthiness. He had brown eyes that moved quickly and hands that, when he was nervous, arranged and rearranged whatever objects were nearby inkstones, tea bowls, the folds of his robe, as if orderliness could be a form of protection. Bao Dat was not climbing this mountain by choice. He was climbing it because his duty was to attend the retired emperor, and the retired emperor was climbing it, and that was the nature of attendance in his mind, which was moving considerably faster than his legs. Several parallel calculations were underway, whether the mist would clear before noon, whether the provisions he had organized, the dried fish wrapped in oiled cloth, the barley cakes, the small bronze pot for heating water, were sufficient for a journey of uncertain length, whether his sandals, which had a loose binding on the left, would hold, and underneath all of this, like a bass note in music, that the ear registers without consciously attending to, a more persistent question he had been carrying for months, without quite knowing where to set it down. The question was, what am I doing? Not in reference to the mountain climb, not even in reference to his service, which he performed competently and without visible complaint. He meant the larger thing. He had been raised to one position: respect, advancement, the clear sequential goods that a family of his background considered the content of a worthy life. And he had them, in a form he had not expected: service to an imperial figure, proximity to a man whom the whole nation revered. His family was proud. His future was assured. He should, by every metric available to him, feel settled. He felt. Instead, as though he was perpetually waiting for something to begin, they stopped twice during the ascent. The first time because a stone had worked itself into Bao Dat's loose sandal and he had to remove it, and then remain bent over the sandal for an embarrassingly long time, working the binding tight enough to hold, while the retired emperor stood watching the forest with the expression of a man who finds standing in a foggy bamboo forest in the early morning entirely sufficient. The second stop was on a broad, flat stone part-way up, where the path widened briefly before turning steep again. The mist was thinner here. A narrow valley was visible below, rice fields and a river, and the slate roofs of a small village still sleeping. The retired emperor sat down on the stone, set his staff across his knees, and looked at the valley. Bao Dat stood beside him, uncertain whether to sit, uncertain whether the stone was large enough for both of them, uncertain about everything, which was his default condition. After several minutes of silence, the retired emperor spoke without turning his head. "You've been carrying something all morning." Bao Dat began to say he was not tired, that the pack was manageable, that the provisions were well organized. "Not the pack," the retired emperor said. He said it without impatience. He had the particular quality of voice that Bao Dat had noticed from the beginning of their service together, unhurried, as though the space between words was as significant as the words themselves. "The thing you were carrying before we started." Bao Dat was quiet for a moment. He looked at the valley below, the rice fields holding a faint reflected light in the morning mist. A heron was working the margins of the river, moving with the slow, deliberate steps of something that has learned there is no advantage in rushing. "I don't know how to be at rest," he said. He said it simply, without planning to say it, the way truths sometimes come out when the conditions are unexpectedly right. The retired emperor was quiet in that way of his. Not the silence of a man waiting for the right moment to speak. The silence of a man for whom silence itself is not uncomfortable. "Tell me what you mean by rest," he said at last. "Baudat trid." He talked about the way his mind moved, always calculating, always preparing, always measuring the gap between where things were and where they ought to be. Even in sleep, he said, and this was not an exaggeration. His dreams often took the form of tasks, things to arrange, things to verify, situations that required managing. He woke tired, not from sleep, but from the labor of sleeping. Even standing on this mountain, even now, a part of him was already cataloging what remained to be done before they reached the summit. "I have tried meditating," he added, with the slightly apologetic tone of someone confessing to a failed experiment. "I sit very still, but the mind just continues." "And what?" the retired emperor said. "Do you imagine rest looks like if you achieved it?" Baudat thought about this. No more calculation. The mind just quiet. Nothing to arrange or consider. "Ah." The retired emperor turned his head then and looked at Baudat directly. There was something in the quality of that look, not the weighing of a king who has decided many things, but the simple, steady attention of a person who has stopped needing the other person to be any different than they are. When you walk, Baudat, when you are walking and not calculating, truly just walking, one foot and then another, is that rest? Baudat thought about the morning's walk. There had been moments, a stretch of path through thick bamboo where the light came down green and cool, and the sound of his feet on the earth, and the sound of the retired emperor's staff, and the drip of the condensed mist from the bamboo leaves had been, for a few minutes, simply what they were. No plan, no catalogue, just the green light and the wet path and the weight of the pack settling on his shoulders as something familiar rather than something to manage. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "when I stop noticing that I'm walking, when you stop watching yourself walk," the retired emperor said, "when the noticing and the walking become one thing." He looked back at the valley. "That is not the absence of mind. That is mind at rest in what it is already doing. The heron does not think about whether it is a good heron. It is simply looking for fish, and it is completely the heron doing it." Baudat looked at the heron. It had stopped walking and stood perfectly still now at the river's edge, one foot raised slightly, its long neck curved in that posture of absolute ready detention that herons have, which looks from a distance like the posture of someone about to receive important news. "My teacher," the retired emperor said, and when he said, "my teacher," the gentleness in his voice was the gentleness of someone speaking of the dead. My teacher, Tu Trung, was a layman. He had a family, a household, responsibilities. He never shaved his head. He ate meat sometimes, which caused great scandal among the more rigid monastics. He told me once, "The treasure is already in the house. You do not need to search outside. You have been searching outside for what was never outside." He stood then, without announcing it, the way he did everything simply and directly, as though motion were no more complicated than the decision to make it. He picked up his staff. "When we are hungry, we eat. When we are tired, we sleep. When we walk, vervalg." The peace you are looking for is not at the end of the arrangement you are trying to make. It is in the walking. They continued up the mountain. Something shifted in Baudat, over the course of that afternoon's climb, not dramatically, not with the sensation of arriving somewhere new, more the way a muscle releases when it has been held tense for so long that the tension has become invisible. And then something simple and ordinary, a warm stone, a full breath, a moment of forgetting the catalogue, lets it go. He stopped arranging things in his mind for a stretch of path where the bamboo gave way to old pine trees, enormous and dark and fragrant in the damp air, their roots crossing the path like the submerged backs of enormous animals. He simply walked. The pack was heavy. The path was steep. His breath was audible in the quiet forest. And all of this, the weight and the steepness and the sound of his own breathing, was simply what was happening, not a problem to be managed, not a condition to be improved, just the alive reality of being a body, ascending a mountain on a December morning in the 13th century of the Common Era, in a country that had survived twice and was continuing. They reached the ridge as the mist began to break. Light came through from the west, pale and thin at first, then strengthening into the specific gold of late afternoon winter sun, the kind that makes everything it touches seem illuminated from within rather than lit from without. The bamboo above them caught it and held it. The valley far below became visible through the dissolving cloud, the rice fields a dark green, the river silver, the village still and small. The retired emperor stopped and looked at it for a long time. Then he said, quietly, not to Baudat particularly, more to the air, when hungry, eat, when tired, sleep. Treasure is within, cease the searching, face the world with an empty mind. No need to ask about Zen. He had written these words himself in his great prose poem about living in the world and finding joy in the Dharma. He had been writing them, in a sense, his entire life, since the night he ran from the palace in bare feet and walked into the dark, not knowing where he was going, only that what he was going toward was more real than what he was leaving behind. This is the teaching that the Vietnamese Thian tradition calls Cu Tran Lac Dao, living in the world and finding joy in the Dharma. Not the Dharma found by leaving the world, not the peace discovered in monasteries and achieved through the accumulation of practice. The peace of the hungry person who eats and is satisfied. The peace of the tired person who lies down and is held. The peace of the walking person who walks and is, for that moment, entirely themselves. Dan Nhan Tong, the emperor who became a monk and is still called the Buddha of Vietnam by the people of his country more than 7 centuries after his death, taught something that is easy to say and remarkably difficult to hear. The pattern that keeps us from peace is not the world's noise, or the body's tiredness, or the mind's busyness. It is the assumption that peace requires different conditions than the ones we already have. The pattern is the gap we insist on placing between where we are and where peace is permitted to live. The mind that says, when this is arranged, then I will rest. When this is resolved, then I will be at ease. When the pack is lighter and the sandal is repaired and the summit is reached and the things I need to verify have been verified, then the rest and the teaching, which is not complicated but costs something to receive, is now. Now is when the treasure is in the house. Now is when the heron is the heron. Now is when the foot finds the earth and the breath moves and the mountain is exactly the mountain. It already is. The mind that is planning tonight is not an obstacle to rest. It is the mind that, when you let it do its planning without fighting it, without needing it to stop, before peace is allowed, eventually finds the rhythm of the walk. One step and then another. The breath following without your management. the body warm beneath the blanket, as Bao Dat's body was warm that night on Yentu Mountain. In a thin-walled room near the hermitage, the smell of pine resin and cold stone, and the faint sweetness of bamboo sap in the air, the mountain silent above and below. He did not sleep immediately, but somewhere in the space between the arrangements he was making in his mind and the weight of the mountain pressing down into the earth beneath him, he stopped noticing he was lying down. He simply was. The warm darkness, the sound of the forest, the breath. When hungry, eat. When tired, sleep. The treasure is in the house. Feel the weight of the body settling now into whatever is beneath you. The breath will move on its own. The mind will do what minds do. And underneath all of it, already here, already sufficient, the ground. You don't need to reach the summit. You are already on the mountain, and the mountain holds you exactly as you are. Let the shoulders soften just a little more. Feel the warmth. The breath continues. And as Bao Dat's calculating mind found, in the darkness of that mountain night, something it had been looking for in every arrangement it had ever made. We travel now far south and across the sea, into the forest monasteries of ancient Sri Lanka, where a nun named Ambapali had been trying to understand why the rain would not cooperate with her practice. In the forest, groves outside the city of Vaisali, in the ancient land of what is now northern India and Nepal, during the last years of the Buddha's teaching, there lived a woman who had once been the most celebrated courtesan in the known world and was now simply old. Her name was Ambapali. She had been found as an infant in a mango grove amber, the mango, Pali. The keeper of the grove left there by people whose names and reasons were never recorded. The gardener who found her took her in, raised her, and watched her grow into a beauty so remarkable that the princes of several kingdoms disputed her right to marry. Their quarrel resolved only by an arrangement no one was especially proud of. She would belong to all of them, to none of them, to herself, formerly a Ganika, a public woman, one of the few roles in ancient India that permitted a woman to own property, to conduct business, to be in some sense sovereign over her own life. She had been all of this for many years. She had been wealthy, admired, sought after, and intermittently lonely, in the way that people are lonely when they are surrounded by desire, but not by love. She had a son by the king of Magadha, a boy named Vimala, who grew up with the particular quality of a child, raised between worlds, knowing privilege without quite belonging to it, knowing beauty without being fooled by it. When Vimala came of age, he entered the Buddha's order of monks. His mother followed him to the Dharma, listened to the teachings, and eventually gave the Buddha and his Sangha her mango grove, the grove that had been her name's origin, the grove that contained her entire livelihood and her only real property, with a directness and a lack of ceremony that the monks present found both disarming and instructive. She had ordained some years after that. Now she was old. The forest hermitage where she spent her days was a small raised platform of aged teak wood, set back from the path among a stand of ancient banyan trees whose aerial roots had grown so numerous and thick over the decades that they had created a kind of open-air room, the roots like columns around the platform, the canopy far above, in perpetual soft movement in the afternoon heat. In the rainy season, the roof of leaves kept most of the rain out. In the dry season, the platform sat in a quiet and fragrant shade. Ambapali spent her mornings and evenings in sitting meditation here, her afternoons in walking practice on the path that circled the outer edge of the grove, her meals eaten in the simple way of forest monastics, rice, and whatever was offered on alms, round. Nothing after midday, eaten without haste and without complaint about what it was. She was not avoiding anything. She was not performing anything. This was simply the shape her life had taken over many years, the way water takes the shape of whatever holds it, not forced into it, not resisting it, but settling with the natural completeness of things that have found their level. She had a companion in the hermitage, a young novice nun named Sumana, who had come to study with her 6 months earlier at the suggestion of a senior monk who had said, with his customary unhelpfulness, only that Ambapali had something Sumana needed, and that Sumana would know it when she found it. Sumana was named then. She had entered the order 2 years earlier from a merchant family in Vassali, motivated by a sincerity that no one who met her doubted, and a seriousness that occasionally alarmed them. She meditated with what she herself described as diligence, sitting every morning and evening for the prescribed periods, observing her precepts with careful attention, studying the teachings with the concentrated intensity she had previously applied to her family's accounting records. The problem, which she had been unable to name, but which sat in her chest like a smooth stone dropped into still water, disturbing everything in expanding rings, was that none of it seemed to be working. She had been meditating for 2 years. The mind was still the mind. It still wandered, still judged, still constructed elaborate narratives about her own progress and lack of it. She could observe her breath for 100 breaths without distraction, and then notice herself, observing herself doing it correctly, and the noticing would collapse the doing, and she would be back where she started. Aware of awareness. A loop that seemed to have no exit. She read the suttas and found them clear and reasonable. She agreed with them. She understood them. And then the understanding sat in her, inert, not transforming anything, the way a key can fit perfectly in a lock without turning. She had come to Ambapali expecting to receive a teaching she hadn't heard yet. Some formulation that would finally produce the result. Some practice she was missing. Some instruction that the old woman's long experience had yielded. Something efficient and specific that Sumana could apply with her considerable diligence and finally arrive wherever it was that the teachings kept pointing. What she received instead, for the first 6 months, was almost nothing. Ambapali meditated. Sumana meditated beside her. They did walking practice. They ate their single daily meal in companionable silence. In the evenings, if there was enough light, Ambapali sometimes recited from the suttas in a low voice, without commentary, the way a person hums a song they have known for a long time, not performing it, not teaching it, simply in the presence of it. And that was essentially all. Sumana had begun to wonder if the monk had made a mistake in sending her here. On a morning in the dry season, the air carrying the smell of red laterite dust and dried leaves, and the distant sweetness of flowering trees she couldn't identify, Sumana arrived at the platform to find Ambapali not sitting in meditation, but simply sitting, leaning slightly forward, watching something on the wooden planks in front of her, with an expression of unhurried interest. Sumana looked. It was a beetle, black-shelled, moving in a slow and purposeful arc across the platform, apparently engaged in going somewhere specific by a route that was not straight, but was, from the beetle's perspective, apparently perfectly adequate. "I've been watching it for half an hour," Ambapali said, without looking up. Sumana stood uncertainly. She had missed, it seemed, 30 minutes of their morning sitting period for the observation of a beetle. "Should we," she started. "Sit down," Ambapali said, not unkindly, as an observation that sitting down was the natural thing to do at this moment. Sumana sat. They watched the beetle complete its arc and disappear into a crack between the planks. "You've been trying very hard," Ambapali said. After a while, it wasn't quite an accusation. It wasn't quite a compliment. "I'm trying to practice correctly," Sumana said, hearing as she said it how defensive it sounded. "I know." Ambapali turned to look at her. Her face was very old, the skin folded in long, soft wrinkles, the eyes deep set and dark, the mouth carrying the particular set of a face that has been through many things and has stopped pretending otherwise. But there was nothing defeated in it, nothing resigned. It was the face of someone who had arrived somewhere, not somewhere elevated, not somewhere extraordinary, somewhere simply, completely, and irrevocably at rest. "What are you trying to arrive at?" Sumana tried to answer. She said she was trying to develop concentration, insight, liberation from suffering, the things the suttas said to develop. "And when you sit," Ambapali said, "what are you doing with the trying?" "I keep the mind on the breath. And when the mind wanders, I bring it back. And when it wanders again, I bring it back again." "And how do you feel?" Ambapali said, with the calm directness that Sumana had learned by now was not cruelty, but something much more useful. "When you have to bring it back?" Sumana thought about this honestly. "She felt," she admitted, a faint but consistent flash of something that was not quite frustration, more like the feeling of a person who has set up a very neat room and then turned around to find it disordered again, a feeling of failure that was too small to name, but too persistent to ignore, a sense that the mind was not cooperating with her practice, that the mind was the problem, that the mind needed to be brought under the kind of governance that would eventually, if applied with sufficient effort and duration, produce the stillness she was looking for. "The mind is the problem," she said. Ambapali was quiet for a moment. A small brown bird landed on the railing of the platform, looked at them both with the flat professional assessment of a bird deciding about seeds, and flew away. "When I was young," Ambapali said, "I spent a great deal of effort on my appearance. Not vanity, exactly. It was more like governance. I believed, because I had some evidence for this belief, that if the appearance was managed correctly, the outcomes of my life would be manageable. There was security in that, control over the thing that people valued, and therefore, through that, some control over what happened to me." She held out her left hand, palm up, and looked at it. The skin was loose and spotted. The knuckles were swollen with age. The fingers curved slightly inward, the way old hands do. "And then this?" she said, without bitterness, simply as fact, and all the governance was pointless. Everything I had worked to control was already leaving before I started working. Sumana looked at the hand. The body could not be governed into permanence. Ambapali said, "And the mind cannot be governed into peace. Not because peace is unavailable, it is the most available thing there is, but because governance is exactly the activity that makes peace feel unavailable. The mind trying to improve the mind is like a hand trying to catch its own shadow. The hand is very real. The shadow is very real. But the catching is not something that catches." Sumana felt something shift, very slightly, in her chest. Not arriving, not resolving. Something more like a question mark that had been turned, After a long time facing one direction, a few degrees the other way, "Then what do I do?" she asked. "You are doing it," Ambapali said. "You have been doing it since you sat down. The breath is breathing. The awareness is aware." The beetle walked across this platform without effort. The bird landed and departed. You are sitting here, alive, noticing the bare fact of it, not the story you tell about it, not the assessment of whether it is good enough. Noticing. That is the thing the practice is pointing at. It was never pointing at something you had to create. It was pointing at what you already are. She lowered her hand back to her lap. The body grew old, and I could not stop it. I wrote about this, after I understood verse by verse, part by part. My hair that had been black as bees is now like old rope. My eyes that had been bright are dim. My legs that had been graceful are stiff. And every verse ends the same way. It is just as the teacher said. It would be nothing different. Not a judgment. Not a complaint. Just the truth. Recognized. She paused. This is what I learned from aging. Not that impermanence is sad. That impermanence is the form peace takes when you stop arguing with it. They sat in silence for a long time after this. The dry season air moved through the banyan roots in a slow, intermittent breath. The smell of dust and distant flowers. The sound of the path outside the grove. Footsteps and birdsong and the faint creak of a cart somewhere far off. All of it arriving without permission, departing without assistance, completing itself in each moment, as entirely as the beetle had completed its arc across the platform. Sumana breathed. She was not, in that moment, trying to breathe correctly. The breath moved because breath moves, because the body is alive and bodies breathe, because this is what being alive feels like from the inside air entering, air leaving, the chest rising and releasing, on and on, since the morning of birth, without a single breath requiring her supervision or her improvement. She noticed this. Then she noticed herself, noticing it. Then she noticed that the noticing itself was just another moment of the same thing, awareness. Present. Doing what awareness does, which is simply to be present to what is. No effort had produced this. No effort was required to maintain it. It was the ground, exactly as Ambapali had said. The floor under the governance project, unchanged by the project, available the moment the project was set aside. She exhaled slowly. Ambapali said nothing. She did not comment on the shift, did not acknowledge it, did not turn it into a moment of teaching that could be placed in a category and filed away for future reference. She simply sat and breathed, and in her very ordinariness demonstrated the thing she had described, a mind not governing itself into peace, but resting in what it had never stopped being. This is the teaching that Ambapali left us, not in the words of the Theragatha only, not in the 20 verses that catalogue the body's impermanence with unflinching and ultimately peaceable precision, but in the quality of presence that her story contains. A woman who had tried, for decades, to control what could not be controlled, and who discovered in that failure something immeasurably more reliable than control. The pattern that Sumana carried is the same pattern that exhausts most of us, who bring a serious mind to the question of peace. We make the project of peace into exactly the thing that prevents it. We sit down to meditate and immediately begin governing, evaluating the quality of the session, measuring the stillness against a standard, bringing the wandering mind back with a faint edge of management. In the bringing, we try, and the trying itself is the distance between us and the thing we are trying to reach. This is not the mind's fault. The mind is doing what minds learn to do in a world that rewards effort and competence. The mind is applying the strategy that has served it for most of its life. If you work hard enough, and correctly enough, and long enough, the good outcome arrives. This works for learning languages, for building businesses, for repairing relationships, for almost everything that involves acquiring something that was absent. It does not work for peace. Because peace is not absent. It is not across the room. It is not at the end of the corridor of correct practice. It is the floor, the ground, the backdrop against which all the seeking and governing and trying and noticing takes place, unchanged by any of it, available before the first effort, and present after the last one, as close and as ordinary as the breath that is moving right now, without your effort, without your governance, without your improvement. Notice it for a moment, not in order to meditate correctly, not as a technique for producing stillness, not with the part of you that grades and measures. Just notice that the breath is there, that it continues, that it has been continuing since the first morning of your life, and that you have never once needed to remember to do it, and that tonight it will continue through every hour of sleep, faithful and automatic. The body's oldest intelligence doing what it knows how to do. The mind that is restless tonight is not failing at anything. The thoughts still moving are not obstacles to rest. Ambapali sat with a restless mind for years, and the restlessness was not the problem. The governance of the restlessness was the problem. When she stopped trying to produce peace and simply sat in the already present ground of awareness, the question dissolved, not because the mind went quiet, because the mind's noise was no longer something she was fighting. Let the mind be as it is tonight. Let the thoughts move. If they move, let the awareness be present to them, the way the air in the banyan grove was present to every sound and smell and movement, not holding any of it, not rejecting any of it, simply the space in which it all took place. You are that space. You have always been that space. The governing, the project, the work of getting to peace, these are movements within you, not you. They have been passing through since morning. They will pass through tonight. And underneath them, unchanged, already resting the awareness that is always here, already resting, already, without your effort, completely whole. Breathe. Let the body be held exactly as it is. The blanket, the darkness, the quiet, they are already doing everything that needs to be done. If you drift off now, that is the practice completing itself. Let it. And as Sumana's breath deepened in the afternoon shade of the banyan grove, her governance finally set aside, her awareness finally resting in what it had always been, we travel now westward, across the sea of years, to the high stone monasteries of Tibet, where a different kind of wildness was waiting in the most unexpected of teachers. The cave was 3 days' walk from the nearest village, up through terrain that made most people reconsider whatever had seemed urgent enough to bring them this far. The path from the Nyalem Valley in western Tibet began easily enough, a wide dirt track between stone walls, past barley fields turning gold in early autumn, past the smell of dung fires and barley beer and the soft bells of yaks moving to lower pasture before the cold came down from the high ridges. Then the track narrowed, and the valley walls rose steeply on either side, the air thinning, in a way you noticed, not all at once, but gradually, in the way that a long accumulation of small changes eventually announces itself as something irrevocable. By the second day, the last farms were behind you. By the third morning, there was only stone and sky, and the sound of wind finding its way through rock faces with the patient persistence of something that had been doing this for longer than anyone could account for. The two high passes sat between the valley floor and the limestone shelf, where the cave opened its dark mouth below an overhang of grey rock. At the second pass, the wind came in horizontally, without warning, smelling of ice and carrying fine particles of snow that were not yet snow, not committed enough to fall, just suspended in the air at the level of the face, coating the eyelashes and the beard of anyone foolish or determined enough to be standing there. Below the second pass, the path dropped into a brief gully of dwarf juniper and yellowed grasses before the final ascent through loose shale to the shelf. Prayer flags had been strung above the cave entrance by previous visitors, faded now, the colors beaten out of them by years of high-altitude sun until they were all the same, pale grey-white, the fabric fraying where the wind caught the edges and pulled. Below the flags, a cairn of white stones, very old, beginning to settle into the hillside as though they were becoming part of it. The young monk Dawa had made this journey 3 times in 4 years. He was 25, from a monastery in the Manang Valley, 2 days south, and he had come the first time out of the curiosity that a young man carries before experience, has sorted it into something more specific, and the second and third times out of something harder, to name a need to be near this particular teacher, that was not quite devotion in the formal sense, and not quite need in the ordinary sense, but contained elements of both, and underneath those, something simpler, the particular comfort of being in the presence of someone who had already gone through what you are afraid of and had not been destroyed by it. The teacher the world knew as Milarepa had been born in a prosperous family in western Tibet, the son of a man who died too young and left his wealth to be consumed by an aunt and uncle who treated the boy's mother and sister with a comprehensive cruelty that was, if not spectacular, thorough and sustained. His mother had pressed him toward revenge with the specific blindness of a woman whose love had narrowed to a single channel. He had learned the dark arts. He had done what she asked. And then the weight of it had settled on him with the particular density of things you cannot undo, not the sudden weight of immediate guilt, but the slow accumulated weight of years during which you understand more completely, as time passes, the full shape of what you have done. What followed was the years with Marpa the translator, his teacher, years that from the outside looked like abuse and from the inside looked like something necessary, whose necessity could not be explained in simpler terms. Marpa had given him tasks that made no sense by any reasonable standard. Build this tower alone with your hands. Now tear it down and return each stone to where you found it. Now build it again here. Now tear it down. The towers rose and fell on the hillsides of Lodrak like the breath of some enormous patience, and Milarepa's hands bled and cracked and healed and bled again, and the weight of what he had done slowly changed its nature, not diminishing, but transforming, the way grief transforms over years, not into its absence, but into something that can be carried differently. And then Marpa had finally given him the teachings he had been preparing him for all along, and Milarepa had gone alone into the mountains. Dawa had heard the stories of those years, the solitary decades in caves across the high Himalayas, the nettle soup that was not metaphor, but literal truth, the green cast that the nettles eventually gave to the skin and hair, the body thinning to essential structure, every layer of social presentation stripped away by cold and hunger and isolation until what remained was whatever was most fundamentally itself. The songs that arose from the practice, not as performance, but as natural expression, the way heat rises from fire, the way water finds downhill without being directed there. The 100,000 songs preserved in texts that Dawa had studied in his monastery, that contained the teachings in a form that was simultaneously completely personal and completely general, as the best teachings always are. On the particular morning of this story, Dawa arrived at the cave shelf after 3 days of walking. In the early light, before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge, and found the cave entrance strange. Not empty, the teacher's absence had its own quality, and this was different. The small clay offering bowl that sat on a flat stone to the left of the entrance had been knocked sideways. The dried juniper berries it contained, scattered across the shelf and beyond it, some of them lying on the shale slope below. The grass at the entrance was pressed flat in several places, as though multiple large things had sat there for some time. The air held a quality Dawa could not name with precision present, charged. The way air holds something before weather changes, but with a quality of having been contested, of two things having recently occupied the same space with incompatible intentions. He sat down on the flat stone near the entrance and waited. After perhaps an hour, the sound of footsteps on loose shale came from below. Then Milarepa appeared at the edge of the shelf, carrying a bundle of dried dung for the fire in one arm. Moving with the unhurried directness Dawa had noticed from the first visit, not slow with deliberateness, not performing serenity, simply the movement of a body that had stopped arguing with the ground beneath it. He saw Dawa and nodded, set the dung bundle beside the entrance, and lowered himself onto his usual sitting stone with the care of a body that has worked very hard for many decades and has accepted this fact without complaint. "You came," he said. "What happened here?" Dawa asked. He gestured at the scattered berries, the flattened grass, the particular quality of the air. Milarepa looked at the cave entrance for a moment, with an expression that Dawa had seen on him before, the look of a man reviewing a recent event and finding it interesting from the perspective of having survived it. Not triumphant, not shaken, interested, in the way that a person who has learned to pay attention is interested in whatever the practice produces, whatever form that takes. "I came back from gathering firewood yesterday evening," Milarepa said, "and found the cave full of demons." Dawa had been studying long enough to understand that when the teacher made a statement like this, the correct response was not to decide whether it was literal and then react accordingly. The correct response was to be present to all of what was being said, which was always more than the literal surface. "Many of them?" Dawa asked. "The cave was full," Milarepa said. "Every corner, squatting on my sleeping mat, handling my texts with their thick green hands, cooking my food without asking, occupying every surface as if they had been there longer than I had. Enormous ones and smaller ones, and one very large one near the back that I noticed immediately and then chose not to look at directly, which I understood even then was a mistake." He paused. A raven landed on the cairn of white stones, regarded them both with the flat professional assessment of ravens, assessing everything, and departed without apparent conclusion. "What did you do first?" Dawa asked. "What I always do first," Milarepa said. "What I suspect you do first. And your teacher, and his teacher before him. I tried to drive them out." He said this without embarrassment. He had long since passed the stage where self-criticism served any purpose. I recited the most powerful exorcisms Mapa had given me, the ones that have worked before, on smaller things, in less serious circumstances. I filled the cave with the sound of the teachings, the nature of impermanence, the unreality of appearances, the empty, luminous nature of mind. I sat in my teacher's posture and transmitted the Dharma with all the authority I have earned in 30 years of this practice. He looked at Dawa. They laughed. The small ones first, then the large ones, and finally, the enormous one near the back. A sound like boulders settling. Dawa said nothing. He was listening to the whole of it. So I tried force. Milarepa continuji. I stood up and shouted. I moved toward them aggressively, the way you would move toward a dog that is threatening you, making yourself large. I used the techniques for working with appearances that the Mahamudra teachings describe, seeing through them, recognizing their emptiness, not according them the solidity of something real. He paused. You understand what happened. They became more solid. Dawa said, each effort I made to remove them made them more settled, as though my resistance was the exact substance they required to become more real. The more I fought, the more the fighting itself was producing them. They were made partly of my refusal to have them. And as my refusal intensified, they intensified, like fire fed by the wind, trying to blow it out. He turned the juniper berry over once more and set it on the stone beside him. Eventually, I sat down, not as a tactic. I sat down because I had exhausted every tactic, and the sitting was what was left. The wind came across the shelf, brief and cold, and passed. I looked at each of them, Milarepa said, not to assess them, or to plan what to do about them, or to see if any of them were weakening. I looked at them the way you look at weather, not warm enough to change it, not separate enough to pretend it is elsewhere, simply in the same field as it, present to it. And I said, out loud, in my ordinary voice, it appears we are going to be here together for now. I open myself to what this contains. Dawa sat with this. Most of them left. Milarepa said, gradually, without drama. Not because I had found the correct technique, because the event that had been being created by the tension between us, the event that required both my resistance and their insistence to sustain itself, that event simply stopped being produced when I withdrew my half of its production. Most of what we experience as a problem requires our resistance to remain a problem. The problem and the resistance to it are often the same thing, wearing different faces. Most of them, Dawa said. One remained. Milarepa said, the largest, the one I had noticed first, and then chosen not to look at directly. It was still near the back of the cave, and it had not softened when the others left. If anything, it had intensified as though it had absorbed the energy of the ones that dissolved. Flowering nostrils. An open mouth. The particular quality of something that has been in the cave for a very long time and intends to remain. He was quiet then, for a longer pause, watching the valley below come further into the morning light, the shadows shortening against the rock, faces across from them. I looked at it for a long time. He said at last, I could feel in myself the last reserve, the part that sits behind the experience and monitors it from a slight distance, the part that says, I am willing to be with this up to a point. I am willing to be present to this, but I am keeping an exit available. I am willing to put myself through some of this, but I am not willing to be entirely consumed by it. He turned and looked at Dawa directly. You know this part? Yes, Dawa said. It is the part that makes us brave without quite surrendering. It is the part that practices without quite trusting the practice. It is not cowardice. It is the mind's oldest protection, the one it developed before it had any teachings at all, the one that has kept it alive through many difficult things. He nodded slowly. as though acknowledging the protection for what it was, and it was exactly the thing that was preventing the last demon from dissolving. Dawa waited. I put my head in its mouth, Milarepa said simply. Dawa looked at him. I offered myself completely to it, Milarepa said. Not from resignation, not because I had given up and decided to be consumed, but because I finally understood that the last reserve, the watching, the exiting, the keeping something back, was the food. That demon lived on the distance I was maintaining from it. When I removed the distance completely, when I said with my entire body and mind, "Eat me if you need to," I am not holding any part of myself away from this. When I withdrew the last reserve entirely and was fully, without management, in the presence of this thing, he paused. It bowed, he said, and dissolved into the air of the cave as though it had never been made of anything more solid than my own refusal to have it. Dawa sat in the morning light on the cave shelf, with the cold rock beneath him and the prayer flags above him fraying in the Himalayan wind, and the raven returned to the cairn and departed again, and the valley far below continued to do what valleys do, which is to hold whatever passes through them without preference for any of it. The demons come back, Dawa said. It was not a question. The cave is a cave, Milarepa said. Caves are where things shelter from weather. The teaching is not that demons stop coming. The teaching is about the resistance, which is to say, the teaching is about what you do with the last reserve, the part of yourself you hold back from full contact with what is difficult. He stood, steadily, and picked up the dung bundle. When that releases not by decision, not by technique, but by the genuine willingness to be entirely present with whatever is here, what you find is not consumption. What you find is space, the space that was always there behind the resistance, that the resistance was costing enormous energy to maintain. That space is not disturbed by what moves through it. It is not made less by fear or more by peace. It holds everything equally, the way the mountain holds both the storm and the calm, unchanged in itself by either. He went into the cave to start the fire. Dawa remained on the stone for a while longer. Far below, the last shadow retreated from the valley floor, and the morning completed itself in full light. Somewhere on the ridge above, a snow leopard or something that walked like one crossed a patch of snow and was gone. This is the tradition of the Kagyu lineage, the school that holds as its central practice not doctrine or ceremony, but the direct experience of the mind's nature. In whatever form it presents itself, Milarepa, 1052–1135, lived his entire adult life in caves, wearing a single cotton robe while the Himalayan winter did what Himalayan winters do, eating what he could find, singing songs that nobody asked for and that have survived 9 centuries because they contain something true that cannot be said more economically in any other form. The demon that is present tonight may not be extraordinary. It is likely the familiar one shaped like tomorrow's worry, or the conversation that went wrong, or the long-running low-frequency certainty that something is not quite resolved, not quite enough, not quite settled. You have tried various things with it. You have reasoned with it and recited teachings at it and approached it with force and with compassion and with sophisticated spiritual frameworks that are all, in their way, genuine and all, in their way, insufficient. Try something different tonight. Try sitting with it the way Milarepa finally sat, not to manage it out, not keeping a reserve, not maintaining the distance of the observer who is watching, to make sure the experience does not become too much. Let the last reserve go, just for a moment, just in the space of one slow breath. What you will find is not the thing consuming you. You will find what Milarepa found, that the demon was always partly made of your distance from it, and that when the distance dissolves, the demon has less substance to be made of. What remains is the space, Weide, unchanged, unhurried. The space in which this entire night is taking place, in which all your thoughts and worries and plans are moving like weather through a sky that is not itself weather. You are that sky. You have always been that sky. The reserve, the watching, the keeping, the exit, available. These are movements within you, not you. They have been moving through you all day and will pass through tonight. And underneath them, always, the space that holds it all, without being diminished by any of it. Feel the weight of the body now, the warmth, the breath, the particular quality of this night, which is yours, unrepeatable, already passing into the past, even as it is present. Nothing to drive out, nothing to exile, nothing to resolve before rest is permitted. Let the head rest, gently, in the mouth of whatever remains. You will find it does not consume. You will find it dissolves the moment you stop feeding it with your refusal to have it. The cave is quiet. The fire is going. The mountain holds you exactly as you are, and as that releasing warmth moves through the length of the body, the genuine setting down of the last thing held, we travel now from the high cold of Tibet, down through centuries and across water to the warm forests of northern Thailand, where a monk was about to learn the same teaching from the most ordinary of teachers, an afternoon rainstorm that would not stop when he needed it to. In the forest monastery of Wat Nong Pa Pong in the Ubon Ratchathani province of northeastern Thailand, in the rainy season of 1968, a young American monk was sitting under a teak tree in the afternoon downpour, soaked entirely through his robes and deciding that he had made a serious mistake. His name was Thomas. He had been ordained only 8 months ago, in a ceremony that still felt both impossibly distant and impossibly recent, the way all significant passages of life feel, as though they happened to someone adjacent to you and you have been carrying the memory of watching rather than the memory of being there. He was 26 years old, the son of a newspaper editor from Ohio, educated at a good university where he had studied philosophy with the specific intensity of a person who suspects that what he is looking for is somewhere in the texts, if he just reads carefully enough. He had read carefully enough for 4 years, and then sat for 2 months in a state of organized intellectual despair before hearing about the Thai forest tradition from a friend who had recently returned from Southeast Asia with sunburned shoulders and a quality of quietness that Thomas recognized immediately as something he had never seen in a philosophy classroom. He had arrived at Wat Nong Pa Pong the previous winter, in the dry season, when the forest was dust and heat, and the sound of insects in the long hot afternoons. The monastery had been established in 1954 by Ajahn Chah, a monk from a farming village in this same province, who had spent 7 years wandering the forests of northeastern Thailand in the manner of the ancient Tudong tradition, sleeping under a glot, a large umbrella tent, in tiger country and cobra country, and the cremation grounds where the villagers burned their dead, practicing with the intensity of a person whose disenchantment with study has been replaced by disenchantment with almost everything else except the bare fact of practice itself. Ajahn Chah had settled in a forest known locally as a haunted place, unhealthy with malaria and thick with the kind of dark reputation that forests acquire when they are close enough to villages to be mysterious, but far enough to be unknown. His few early students had endured mosquitoes and fever and the specific loneliness of a forest at night. More had come. The forest had slowly become a monastery without anyone deciding it should. By the time Thomas arrived, Wat Nong Papong held perhaps 40 monks and 10 novices, most of them Thai, living in small wooden kutis scattered among the trees. Life was structured with the precision of a tradition that had learned, over 25 centuries of refinement, exactly how much structure was needed to hold the mind, still enough for it to see itself clearly. They rose at 3 in the morning for chanting. They walked for alms in the villages before dawn. They ate one meal before noon, sitting cross-legged in the sala, eating what had been offered without preference or complaint. They meditated. They worked. They meditated some more. The afternoons were mostly free for walking meditation under the trees or for sleeping, and the evenings brought more chanting and sitting, and occasionally, when Ajahn Chah was present and in the mood, a Dharma talk that could last anywhere from 20 minutes to 3 hours. Delivered in a northeastern Thai dialect that Thomas was still only partly able to follow. He was still learning Thai. This was part of the problem, not the whole problem. If language were the only issue, patience would solve it, but language was a window onto a deeper difficulty, which was that Thomas had come to this forest monastery, carrying a very precise set of ideas about what practice was, what meditation produced, what enlightenment looked like, and what he needed to do to achieve it. He had come equipped with philosophy and determination and the excellent Ohio work ethic of a man who had been taught that sufficient effort applied to any problem will produce the correct result. The forest, the practice, and Ajahn Chah in particular were not cooperating with this framework. His meditation in the mornings was frequently restless. He sat, and the mind did what the mind does, moved toward the past, moved toward the future, constructed narratives about the quality of his practice, and whether it was improving, and what would constitute evidence of improvement, and whether he was meditating correctly, and whether his posture was causing the back pain that had started in the second week, and whether the back pain was preventing deep concentration, and whether concentration was even the right approach, or whether he should be practicing insight instead, and whether the whole structure of his practice was fundamentally sound, or whether he had made an error somewhere in the architecture of his approach that was compounding over time into an irreparable edifice of non-progress. He could sustain this level of productive internal doubt for approximately 3 hours each morning, after which he was genuinely tired from the effort of thinking about his meditation rather than meditating. He had tried to ask Ajahn Chah about this. The conversations had been brief and, from Thomas's perspective, somewhat unsatisfying. The teacher was a compact man with a round face and eyes that seemed to find most of what happened in his vicinity quietly, amusing, not in the dismissive way of someone who has decided nothing matters, but in the warmer way of someone who has seen enough of how minds work to find their particular patterns genuinely interesting rather than worrying. When Thomas described his difficulty maintaining concentration, Ajahn Chah had said, "Good. You know the mind is moving." When Thomas said, "Yes, but it keeps moving and won't stop," Ajahn Chah had said, "Good. You keep knowing." When Thomas said he wanted it to be still, Ajahn Chah had smiled and said something in Thai that Thomas's companion monk translated with evident uncertainty as roughly, "The river does not ask the water to stop being water." Thomas had written this down. He had examined it from several angles. He remained unsatisfied. On this particular afternoon in the rainy season, he had been attempting walking meditation on the long straight path between 2 rows of trees at the monastery's edge when the rain came in without the usual 15-minute warning of darkening sky. It arrived all at once. The way rain in northeastern Thailand arrives in the monsoon months, not beginning, but simply present. A vertical wall of water, that went from absent to complete in less than a minute. Warm, immense, carrying the smell of earth and wet leaves and something mineral that the rain brought down from the air above. Thomas ducked under the nearest large tree, which was a teak whose broad leaves redirected rather than stopped the rain, so that instead of being rained on uniformly, he was rained on with concentration from specific leaf edges that had collected enough water to release it in thin, persistent streams. He shifted. The streams shifted with him in the small breeze that accompanied the rain. He shifted again. Within perhaps 2 minutes, he was soaked entirely through his thin saffron robes, which clung to him in the specific discomfort of wet cloth against wet skin, cold despite the warm rain, heavy in a way that dry cloth was not. He stood there, under the teak tree that was not providing shelter, in the rain that was not stopping, in the forest that was indifferent to his discomfort, and felt the specific frustration of a man whose extensive preparation has failed to include the actual situation in which he finds himself. "You're soaked." He turned. Ajahn Chah was standing a few meters away, under a larger teak, an older tree with a broader canopy that was providing approximately the same degree of non-shelter. He was wearing his robes, which were also wet, and holding a small glass in one hand, and a glass of water he had apparently been carrying from somewhere and had not yet set down. He did not look particularly concerned about being wet. "Yes, Ajahn," Thomas said. "Are you trying to stay dry?" Thomas looked at the streaming teak leaves above him and the rain falling through them and the muddy path becoming mud river below and the distance between the tree and any actual shelter. He said. "I don't think it's working." Ajahn Chah made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had been louder. He looked at the glass in his hand, and then at Thomas, and held the glass up slightly. "You know this glass?" he said. Thomas looked at it. A plain glass, nothing remarkable about it. Water inside, rain outside, the two becoming continuous in the downpour. "It is already broken," Ajahn Chah said. "I know it will fall one day. The wind will knock it from the shelf, or my hand will slip, or the novice who washes the dishes will drop it. I know this. So every time I hold it, every time the water in it is cold, every time it catches the light in the sala, I enjoy it completely. Not despite knowing it will break. Because I know it will break." He lowered the glass. "The rain," he said, "is also already over." He gestured upward with the glass hand in the general direction of the sky, which was entirely grey and showing no signs of completion. "This particular rain will end. Another will come. That one will end. The season will turn. Your robes will dry, and then they will be wet again, and then dry, and one day they will be given to someone else, or burned, or simply worn out. This is the nature of robes." He paused. "This is the nature of everything you will ever hold." Thomas stood in the rain, wet, looking at his teacher, who was also wet and appeared to have made a completely different relationship with the fact of being wet. "But I can't," just Thomas started. "You can't just what?" "I can't just stop wanting to be dry." "I didn't say stop," Ajahn Chah said. He sounded interested rather than corrective. The way he always sounded, as though the student's confusion was genuinely fascinating to him. "I said, the glass is already broken. Not, do not use the glass. Not, do not enjoy the glass. Not, be indifferent to the glass." He tilted it slightly, watching a stream of rainwater run over the rim. "I said, know what it is. Know what it will do. and hold it accordingly, not tightly, not loosely, but in the way you hold something you love and have already accepted losing. Thomas was quiet. When you sit in the morning, Ajahn Chah said, and your mind moves, what do you want it to do? Be still. Thomas said, why? Because that's what meditation is supposed to. He stopped. Ajahn Chah waited. Because I was told it would be still eventually, Thomas said, more carefully, that the stillness would come with enough practice. Stillness comes, Ajahn Chah said. Also agitation comes, also boredom, and energy, and sleepiness, and the sound of insects, and the pain in the back, and the thought about breakfast, and the wonderful clear breath that makes you think it is all beginning to work, and then the thought about the thought, and the analysis of the analysis. He said all of this with the tone of someone reading a list they have memorized and found entirely unremarkable. All of this comes, and all of this goes. I know, Thomas said, but I want the stillness to stay. Ah, said Ajahn Chah. And he was quiet for a moment in a way that indicated the ah contained more than its single syllable. You want to hold the stillness the way you hold something tight. You want to arrange the conditions so that the stillness arrives and then does not depart. He looked at Thomas with the particular expression Thomas had come to recognize as the one that preceded the thing that was going to change how he thought about something. But stillness is also already broken. Every stillness you will ever touch will end. The one that comes after is also already ending. This is not a problem with your practice. This is the nature of everything that arises. The rain continued. The teak leaves delivered their concentrated streams. Then what is the point? Thomas said. Not bitterly. He was past bitterness about this. Had moved through it into something more, like genuinely wanting to understand. If nothing stays, if the stillness goes, and the difficulty comes back, and it all just keeps cycling, what is the practice for? Ajahn Chah set the glass down on a root of the teak tree, where it sat at a slight angle, rain collecting in it alongside the water already there. He looked at it for a moment. The practice is not for collecting stillness, he said. If you let go a little, you will have a little peace. If you let go a lot, you will have a lot of peace. He paused. If you let go completely, you will have complete peace. He turned back to Thomas. Not because the rain stops, not because the mind stops moving, but because the part of you that was fighting the rain, that was bargaining with it, waiting for it to stop, measuring how wet you have become, calculating the distance to shelter that part releases. And what is left is not victory over the rain. What is left is just a man standing in a forest in the rain, which is the actual situation, completely and without remainder. Thomas stood in the actual situation. Vet, in the actual forest, in the actual rain, which continued without consulting him, and something very small, very ordinary released. Not the rain. The rain did not stop. Not the cold of the wet cloth or the ache beginning in his feet from standing too long in one position. Not the mind, which was still noting and assessing, but something underneath those things, a bracing, a resistance, a background effort that had been running since he arrived in Thailand, and possibly since long before that. The effort of making the present moment into a stepping stone toward a better future moment that released, not all the way, not permanently, but enough that for a moment, standing in the rain under the teak tree in the monsoon afternoon in the forest outside Ubon Ratchathani, Thomas was simply there, present, not waiting for the rain to stop, not managing his relationship with the rain, just standing in it, soaked, alive, in the actual warmth of the tropical downpour, which was warm, he realized suddenly, which was actually warm against his cold, wet skin, which he had not noticed until this moment, because he had been too focused on the fact of being wet to notice the quality of the wetness. He stood in the warm rain and breathed. Ajahn Chah picked up his glass, which had collected a small amount of rain into the water already inside it, and looked at it with mild satisfaction. "Every minute with it is precious," he said, and walked back toward the sala, unhurried, apparently unconcerned about being wet in the way that only a person who has stopped fighting being wet can be unconcerned. This is the teaching of the Thai forest tradition, not as philosophy, but as direct practice grounded in the specific sensory reality of forest life. Ajahn Chah spent 40 years teaching in this way, not from abstraction, but from the rain on the roof of the sala, the taste of alms food, the sound of insects in the dark, the specific weight of a clay bowl carried at arm's length down a morning village path. His teaching was always toward this. The glass is already broken. Not as resignation. The glass is still held, still used, still enjoyed, but held in a way that has already accepted its nature. Peace, in this tradition, does not arrive when things improve. It arrives when the fighting stops, not when the difficulty disappears, but when the part of us that is braced against the difficulty, measuring it, bargaining with it, calculating how long until it ends, when that releases, even slightly, the peace that was always underneath the resistance becomes available. Not as an achievement, as what was always there. Think of what you are braced against right now. Not dramatically, not the catastrophic fears, though those are there too. The ordinary bracing, the slight resistance to the fact that sleep has not come yet. The low-level negotiation with the body about whether it is comfortable enough, warm enough, settled enough. The background monitoring of the mind's contents too busy, too slow, too something, not quite right. All of that effort, sustained so continuously, it has become invisible. What would it mean to let go? Just a little of that, not all of it. Not permanently. Not even significantly. Just the small release of, this is the actual situation. The night is as it is. The body is as it is. The mind is as it is. Rain and warmth together. You do not need the mind to be still before rest is permitted. You do not need the thoughts to end before the body is allowed to soften. The stillness you are looking for is not across the room, at the end of sufficient letting go. It is underneath the bracing, already there, the same stillness that was present under all the movement, unchanged by any of it, patient as the forest waiting for the rain to pass. Let go a little. Feel the weight of the body as it actually is, not as it should be, not as you are arranging it to be, but as it already is, pressing down into the softness beneath it, held without effort. Let go a little more. The breath continues. The mind does what minds do, somewhere outside. The world is doing what it does. And underneath all of it, the ground, the same ground Ajahn Chah stood on in the rain, the same ground the ancient forest roots press into, the same ground that holds everything that has ever rested on it. Already broken, already whole, already here. The glass is still in your hand, warm and ordinary and precious, and the rain has already ended, somewhere in the past, or is ending now, or will end in a moment. And none of this requires your management. Let the weight down. Let the breath do what the breath does. Let the warm darkness be what it already is. The forest pool is still. The animals come to drink. You see them clearly, and you are still, and they are still, and the night holds everything equally. And as that stillness settles, real stillness now, not achieved, but arrived at, through the small act of release, we travel now from the warm forests of Thailand, northward, into the mountain monasteries of medieval Japan, where a Soto Zen monk was about to discover something unexpected about the nature of clouds. In the winter of the year 1247, a young monk named Ryokan walked for 11 days through the mountains of Ekizen province to reach the monastery that the teacher Dogen had built in the cedar forest above the Yoshimizu River. The journey was not kind. Snow began on the third day and continued in intervals through the seventh, the kind of snow that falls in the mountains of what is now Fukui Prefecture, not in dramatic storms but in a steady, patient accumulation that coats every surface and compresses the world to a small radius of grey-white. The path was poorly marked above the valley settlements, becoming at times more of an intention than an actual track. A line through the forest where the trees were slightly less dense and the undergrowth slightly less assertive, a line that required interpretation rather than simply following. Ryokan was 23 years old, physically capable and accustomed to discomfort from 3 years of monastic life. None of this made the walking easier. What it meant was that he could continue walking despite the difficulty, which was different from the difficulty being less. He had time to think. 11 days is a great deal of time, especially when you are alone and the country is white and the only sounds are the creak of frozen branches and the muffled percussion of his own footsteps in the snow. He thought about what he was walking toward and about what he was walking away from. And gradually by the 5th day or the 6th, somewhere in the long white afternoons, stopped distinguishing between the two and simply walked. His name, Ryokan, carried the meaning of good tolerance or wide acceptance, a name his mother had chosen, perhaps aspirationally, for a boy who had been observed from early childhood to receive the ordinary inconveniences of existence with an intensity that suggested the ordinary and the inconvenient were not yet reconciled in him. He had been born the son of a mid-ranking official family in Kyoto, raised with books and careful instruction and the expectation that intelligence applied with sufficient effort would produce a life of clarity and measured satisfaction. Intelligence was not the problem. He had that in abundance. He had learned to read at 4, had been studying the Chinese classics at 7, had arrived at his temple ordination at 20, with a mind already furnished with more doctrine than most monks accumulated in a decade. And still the furniture of doctrine sat in an unlit room. He could describe enlightenment from every angle the texts provided. He understood, in the philosophical sense, that requires a certain kind of intelligence to achieve, and another kind entirely to go beyond, that all human beings possess Buddha nature, that awareness is inherently pure, that suffering arises from identification with conditioned mind rather than from any flaw in the nature of things. He could write essays on this. He had written essays on this, essays that his teacher at the Tendai Temple had graded with the kind of approval that consists entirely of confirming what the student has already understood at the level of concept. He was still not at peace. The distance between knowing about the sky and knowing that you are the sky was, he had discovered, immeasurable. He had heard about Dogen the way important things travel in closed communities through the channels that official silence inadvertently creates, by the route of information that is slightly too interesting to stay unspoken. Dogen had abandoned the Tendai establishment. He had spent 4 years in China, where he had found a teacher unlike any he had previously encountered, a master named Rujing at the Tiantong monastery, who had insisted on a quality of meditation practice that went beyond all the frameworks Dogen had been trained in. Under Rujing, something had happened that Dogen described afterward in terms that his contemporaries found both illuminating and impossible to verify from the outside. Shinjin Datsuraku, the casting off of body and mind, a liberation from all intellectual and volitional attachments that was not achieved by accumulating the right understanding, but by the complete release of the one who was doing the accumulating. He had returned to Japan in 1227 and spent years in the capital, increasingly in tension with the established Buddhist institutions, before finally accepting a patron's offer and removing himself entirely from the political complexity of Kyoto to this remote valley in the Ekizen Mountains, where in 1244 he had begun building Eiheiji, the Temple of Eternal Peace. In the mountains, among cedars, far from everything that had been causing interference, what he taught there, what Ryokan had read about in borrowed texts, in partial accounts, in the careful descriptions of monks who had visited and returned with a quality of quiet that Ryokan recognized immediately as something different from mere contentment, was shikantaza. Just sitting. Nothing but sitting. No technique to apply. No object to focus upon. No goal toward which the sitting was a preparation. The practice and the realization were the same event, occurring simultaneously, not in sequence. To sit in Zazen was not to work toward enlightenment. To sit in Zazen with complete, non-grasping attention was enlightenment, not as arrival, but as continuous manifestation. The way a flame is not becoming fire, but is fire at every moment of its existence. Ryokan had understood this. He had understood it very well, and he had gone on sitting at the capital monastery with his busy, evaluating, accomplishment-tracking mind fully engaged, which told him that understanding was precisely the problem, and that understanding could not fix it, and that what he needed was not more understanding, but proximity to someone who had gone to the other side of understanding, into the lived reality the understanding pointed at. Hence the 11 days. The monastery appeared first as a sound, the stream heard through the cedars before anything was visible. A low voice in the winter silence, something continuous and clear. Then the smell of wood smoke. Then, through a final bend in the path where the cedars parted briefly, the buildings, low, dark, with mountain weather, even in their relative newness. The roof lines carrying 2 feet of snow. The main hall flanked by cedars, whose tops were swallowed in the low cloud that had descended into the valley in the night, and not yet lifted. Smoke rose from a kitchen chimney at the eastern end of the compound. A single monk was sweeping the courtyard with deliberate, unhurried strokes, moving a wooden broom across stone that was immediately covered again by the fine snow, still falling. Ryokan stood at the edge of the cedars and watched this for a moment. The monk did not look up. The sweeping continued. The snow continued. Neither seemed troubled by the other. He was received with the formal simplicity of a community that had developed its customs quickly and wore them without self-consciousness, shown to his sleeping mat in a small room shared with 2 other monks, shown his place in the meditation hall, given the schedule assigned to kitchen work, told to present himself at the bell before dawn. No ceremony, no orientation speech, no acknowledgement that traveling 11 days through mountain snow represented any particular effort worth remarking upon. He was a monk. He had come to practice. This was a place of practice. These facts required no elaboration. The mornings at Eiheiji began in the dark. The bell rang at 3. The monks dressed in the dark and walked in silence through the cold corridors to the meditation hall, where they took their places on the long raised platforms and sat facing the wall in the posture that Dogen had prescribed with the care he brought to all things, cross-legged, spine upright but not rigid, hands in the cosmic mudra, eyes half open and cast downward at 45 degrees so that the world was present but peripheral, close but not demanding. They sat until the sky lightened. They chanted. They ate. They worked. They sat again. Ryokan's mind, he discovered within the first week, had made the 11-day journey entirely unchanged. It had arrived at Iheiji with all its previous furniture, intact, the self-assessment apparatus, the measurement instruments, the comparative analysis capabilities. In the mornings, sitting with the community in the cedar-scented cold of the meditation hall, the mountains pressing their silence against the thin walls, his mind proceeded through its habitual inventory with the systematic thoroughness of a good accountant. The quality of the posture, the depth of the stillness, whether the stillness of this sitting compared favorably with the stillness of the previous sitting, whether the improvement or decline in stillness was meaningful or random, whether the fact that he was measuring stillness rather than simply being still was itself the problem, whether awareness of the problem constituted progress or merely added another layer of sophisticated self-observation to the pile. He had brought an exceptionally capable mind to a place that was teaching him to set it down. The irony was not lost on him. It was, in fact, one more thing his very capable mind was tracking. He had been at Iheiji for 3 months when the morning came that he would spend the rest of his life quietly, without making much of it, in the way he had learned to do things, attempting to point back toward. It was late winter. Ekizen in late winter has a quality of cold that is less about temperature than about totality cold, that has been present long enough to have penetrated everything, to have become not a weather event, but a condition of existence, so that the warmth of the fire in the kitchen is not its opposite, but its exception, precious because surrounded on all sides by the cold that will return the moment the fire is not maintained. On this particular morning, the sky had cleared overnight for the first time in 2 weeks, and the cold that accompanied the clearing was of the specific, brilliant kind that arrives when clouds are gone, and there is nothing between the earth and the deep sky to hold any warmth. The meditation hall had one high window on the east wall, narrow, designed to admit light rather than view. Through it, in the early morning, a rectangle of sky was visible, not large, perhaps the size of a panel of shoji screen, but sufficient. The sky at that hour was the deep saturated blue of a clear winter morning above a high mountain valley, a blue with depth rather than surface. The kind of blue that does not feel like a color applied to something, but like the thing itself seen without intervening conditions. Ryokan had been sitting for perhaps an hour when the cloud moved into the rectangle. It was a single cloud, medium-sized, moving from east to west on a wind that was not felt inside the hall. Its shape was not regular. It had the quality of clouds that form in high cold air, more structural than the soft summer kind, with defined edges that were nevertheless continuously dissolving and reforming as it moved. The leading edge was thinning. The trailing edge was gathering. Nothing about it was the same from one moment to the next. Yet it was unmistakably, recognizably, continuously itself, not a different cloud every moment, but the same cloud in continuous transformation. Its identity, not a fixed form, but a persistent process. He watched it, without deciding to watch. His eyes had moved to it the way attention moves to whatever is genuinely happening, when the performance of paying attention stops. The cloud moved. The sky received it without alteration. The sky did not become the cloud. The cloud did not consume the sky. The sky's color was unchanged behind the cloud's white. The sky's vast extent was unchanged by the cloud's presence within it. The cloud's dissolution at its edges was not the sky dissolving it, was the cloud returning to the condition of sky, the water vapor dispersing back into the medium that had always held it, the form releasing into the formlessness that the form had never left in any fundamental sense. And Ryokan sat, watching, and something released that had been held since before. He could remember it being held. Not the mind going quiet. Not concentration, achieving a particular depth or quality. Not anything arrived at through the successful application of technique. Something else, more like recognition. Like turning a corner and seeing a view you have been told about many times and finding that the description, however accurate, was not the thing. The thing was this, that the thoughts moving through his awareness were moving through his awareness in precisely the way the cloud was moving through the sky. They arrived. They changed. They dissolved. None of them was what was watching them. The awareness was not the thought. The watcher was not the watched. The sky was not the weather, and the sky, which was what he was, which was what awareness was, which was what had been present through every thought and every sitting and every moment of evaluating whether the sitting was good enough. The sky had never once been troubled by the weather passing through it. Not because the weather did not come, not because the clouds were not sometimes dense, and the mornings not sometimes entirely overcast, but because trouble was not in the sky's nature. The sky's nature was to hold whatever passed through it in complete openness, unchanged by any of it, vast enough to contain everything without being crowded by anything, present to all weather without becoming the weather. He sat with this until the bell rang. The cloud completed its passage through the window's rectangle and moved beyond his view. Another cloud appeared, different in shape and speed, and moved through and was gone. The sky remained. In the kitchen, washing vegetables with the cold stream water, his hands red and his breath making small clouds of their own in the kitchen air, he noticed that the cold was simply cold, that the vegetables were simply vegetables, that the work was simply work, and that all of these things were moving through the same openness that the clouds had moved through, not problems, not conditions to be resolved before something better could begin. Simply the current weather in the awareness that held everything without needing anything to be different from what it was. He requested time with Dogen in the evening, standing before the teacher in the austere room where the teacher received students, the single lamp making a warm circle in the mountain cold. This morning I sat, Ryokan said, and a cloud moved through the window. Dongweide, the sky, Ryokan said, and could not for a moment continue, because the thing he was trying to say exceeded the available language, and he had enough respect for the thing to not force it into words that would diminish it. Then, the sky was not the cloud. No, Dogen said. I am not my thoughts. Ryokan said. You have never been. Dogen said. His voice was neither warm nor cold, neither confirming nor denying. It had the quality of the sky he was describing, present, receiving, not adding anything unnecessary. Zazen in the morning, which was the instruction he gave everyone, which had always been the instruction, which was the practice itself, and the realization of the practice, and all the intermediate steps between them, compressed into 3 words that were simultaneously a prescription and a description of what already was. This is the spaciousness that the Soto Zen tradition calls the sky mind, not a metaphor for something else, not a state to be achieved by sufficient sitting, but the nature of awareness itself, recognized when the identification with the weather of thought is temporarily loosened. Dogen described it across 40 years of extraordinary writing in the Shobogenzo, approaching it from every angle available to a mind of his range and patience, returning to it again and again, not because it was complicated, but because the readers who needed it were complicated, each arriving with a different layer of obscuring self-concept that required a different angle of approach. The thing itself, the sky nature of awareness, the openness that holds everything without being troubled by any of it, is not complicated. It is the simplest thing that exists. It is simpler than the thoughts that move through it, simpler than the clouds, simpler than the wind. It is what remains when everything else is seen to be passing weather. Right now, in this moment, in the room where you are lying, the thoughts are moving. Some of them are about tomorrow. Some are returning to what happened today and finding it still slightly unsettled. Some are monitoring the body, the degree of comfort, the quality of the warmth, the question of whether this position is the right one. Some are listening for sounds in the house or the street outside. All of this is weather, real weather, present weather, weather with weight and texture, but weather, and underneath it, not below it spatially, but underneath it, in the way that sky is underneath cloud, the awareness that is watching all of this without being disturbed by any of it. The awareness that has been present through every thought you have had today. The awareness that noticed the first anxious thought this morning and has been here without interruption through everything that has happened since. The awareness that is reading these words right now without being the words. That awareness is the sky. It has never been troubled by the thoughts moving through it, even when the thoughts were very dark, even when the sky was entirely overcast and no blue was visible from the inside. The covering was never the sky. The sky was always there, behind the coverage, unchanged, waiting with the infinite patience of something that is not actually waiting, that simply is, in its own nature, openness itself. You do not need to clear the sky. The sky is already clear behind whatever is moving through it. You do not need to empty the mind. The mind's emptiness is already there underneath its fullness. The way the sky's clarity is already there underneath the clouds. Let the thoughts be thoughts. Let them move through. Let the awareness that is watching them be what it is, vast, unhurried, unchanged by whatever passes through it, present to everything without being captured by anything. Feel the weight of the body lying down, the warmth, the breath moving without being directed, the sounds in the room and outside the room. All of this is weather in the sky of awareness. All of it arising, present for its moment, passing. And the sky, which is what you are, simply holds it all, without effort, without preference, without needing any of it to be other than what it is. The cloud passes through the window and beyond. The sky remains. The sky remains. The sky has always remained. Let the thought pass. Let the breath settle. Let the vastness of what you actually are hold this night, the way it has held every night, without work, without loss, without even the effort of holding. And as that openness becomes more available than the weather moving through it, as the sky becomes more familiar than the clouds, we travel now for the last time tonight into the simplest country of all, where the final story will not teach or explain, but will simply walk with you into the place that is already yours. The place where all the stories have always been leading. The place where words finally run out and rest begins. the teak forest monastery of Ledi, in the hill country north of Moniwa in Upper Burma. In the last years of the 19th century, an old monk sat outside his kuti in the dark before dawn and listened to the night finish. His name was Usilananda. He was 71 years old. He had been a monk since the age of 1457 years of sitting, walking, eating what was offered, wearing what was sufficient, sleeping when the body required, and waking when the bell called. His hair was gone. His back had the curve that comes from decades of meditation posture. His hands, resting in his lap, had the quality of things that have spent a long time in the same position and have finally settled into it permanently. The way river stones settle. His face was the face of a person who has spent a very long time paying attention and has largely stopped being surprised by what attention reveals. The forest around him was doing what forests do in the last hour before the sky changes, conducting its own slow transition. The night insects quieting in gradations. The birds beginning their first experimental sounds, neither dark nor light, yet fully committed. The air holding the specific quality of that hour, which is difficult to describe and immediately recognizable, cooler than it was, warmer than it will become, carrying the smell of the teak leaves and the red laterite soil and the faint sweetness of night-blooming flowers, whose names Usilananda did not know and had never tried to learn. He had been sitting here, outside his kuti, on the flat stone that served as both step and seat, since approximately midnight. This was not unusual. He had been a light sleeper for 20 years and had long since made peace with this, not by improving his sleep, but by discovering that the 3 or 4 hours he typically managed were sufficient, that the additional hours of sitting in the dark were not deficit, but practice, that the night in its final quarter had a quality different from the day's practice and different from early night sitting, something open about it that the body found before the mind did. He was thinking, in the loose, unfocused way that 20 minutes of sitting produces not directed thought, just what the mind does when it is resting, but not quite still about the novice. The novice's name was Shin Nyanatiloka. He was 17 years old, the son of a farmer from a village 2 hours south, ordained 6 months earlier, with the cooperation of a father who had one too many sons, and a boy who had one too many questions about why things were the way they were. He was intelligent in the quick, restless way of people who have not yet learned the difference between understanding something and being at peace with it. His questions in Dharma instruction were good questions, precise, patient, working from evidence toward conclusion, and they had a quality that Usilananda recognized as the quality of a mind that would either find what it was looking for or exhaust itself trying, with no particular guarantee of which it would be. 6 months ago, during his first weeks at Ledi, Shinyanatiloka had been unable to sleep. This was common among new novices. The monastery schedule imposed a silence and a stillness that the body, accustomed to the ordinary sociability and movement of village life, found alarming in the first weeks. Some novices managed it by sheer exhaustion, falling into sleep before the mind could engage. Others lay awake for hours, listening to the forest in the dark, constructing worries about the strangeness of everything and the length of the practice ahead. Shinyanatiloka was in the second category. He came to Usilananda after his 3rd sleepless night and said, with the combination of honesty and embarrassment that characterized everything he said, "I cannot stop the mind. I lie down, and it continues." Usilananda had looked at him for a moment and said, "Come and sit with me tonight." That had been 6 months ago. The novice still sometimes came to sit with him in the nights, when sleep was difficult. He had grown quieter in the intervening months, not suppressed, but genuinely quieter, the way a stream grows quieter when it finds a channel that suits it. He had not, as far as U Silananda could observe, solved the problem of sleep, but he had developed a different relationship with the problem, which was not the same as solving it, but was in some respects more useful. Tonight, Shinyanatiloka had come again. He appeared from the direction of the novice's kuti, at the edge of the clearing, moving through the dark with the careful footsteps of someone who has learned to navigate a known space without light. He sat down on the step beside U Silananda without ceremony. He had long since stopped the formal greeting at these night sittings, understanding that U Silananda experienced formality in the dark before dawn as a kind of intrusion into something that belonged to a different register of relationship. He arranged his robe around his legs and was quiet. They sat together for a while without speaking. The forest continued its transitions. The first frog had gone silent. The first bird, something small, in the teak canopy above them, unnamed and therefore present as pure sound, had made its single exploratory call and was now quiet again, waiting to see if the sky would confirm that it was time. The mind, Shinyanatiloka said eventually, not as a complaint, as a statement of the current situation, offered the way a navigator offers a position. Yes, U Silananda said. It has been moving since evening. I lay down and it continued moving. What is it moving through? The novice was quiet for a moment. U Silananda appreciated this. The habit Shinyanatiloka had developed over 6 months of actually checking before answering, of treating the question as a genuine inquiry rather than an invitation to produce the expected response. Tomorrow, Shinyanatiloka said, the recitation in the morning, whether I will make an error, then the error I made last week in the recitation, and whether anyone noticed, and whether they will notice if I make one tomorrow, then the sound of the forest, and whether that sound was an animal, and whether the animal is the kind of concern I should have, then the recitation again, and now I am outside, and the mind is here, and I am telling you about it. U Silananda made a small sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite an agreement, but was somewhere between them, the sound of recognizing something familiar. He had been 17 years old. He remembered the recitation anxiety. Specifically, he remembered lying on his mat in the dark and running through the Pali syllables with the desperate precision of someone who has confused the words with the thing the words described. Put your attention on the breath, he said. Not to control it, not to slow it or deepen it. Simply notice that it is here. A pause. It is here, Shinyanatiloka said. Notice that it moves. It moves. Notice that each movement ends. A longer pause. Yes, the novice said, more slowly. It ends. And then another begins. Does the new breath ask permission of the old one? The novice was quiet in a way that indicated genuine attention. The bird in the canopy made its sound, again the same single note, slightly more confident this time. No, Shinyanatiloka said. It simply arises. And what was the old breath doing while it was here, being breathed? And now it is gone? Yes. Was anything lost? Another long pause. The teak trees above them moved in a breath of pre-dawn air, the large leaves turning slightly, making a sound like the turning of something very old and patient. No, the novice said, nothing was lost. U Silananda let this sit for a while, in the particular way. He had learned to let things sit, not letting it sit in order to let it sink in. Not even letting it sit for any particular reason, just allowing the silence, after something true to be the length it needed to be. Around them, the forest was very slightly lighter than it had been 10 minutes earlier. Not noticeably, you would not say the sky was lightening, but the darkness had the quality of something that has decided its direction and is already moving, however, slowly, toward where it is going. The thoughts, Usilananda said, are doing what the breaths are doing. They arise. They are present for their moment. They pass. A new one comes. The one that passed did not go anywhere terrible. It simply ceased to be a thought that was current and became a thought that had already happened. Does this create a problem when I am watching it? No. Shinyanatiloka said. When I am inside it, yes. When you are inside, the thought who is inside, the novice did not answer immediately. This was a question Usilananda had been asking him, in various forms, for several months. The question was not designed to produce an answer. It was designed to interrupt the automatic process by which a thought convinced itself that there was a thinker behind it, who was its permanent resident. I don't know, Shinyanatiloka said finally. The honesty of it was complete. Good, Usilananda said. Rest in that not knowing. They sat in silence again. The forest around them was now conducting its transition more openly. The sky above the canopy, not yet light, but no longer fully dark. That gradation of darkness that precedes light, the way the breath preceding the exhale precedes the exhale. Somewhere in the undergrowth to the east, something moved through dry leaves with the unhurried rustling of a creature that knows it has the forest to itself for a few more minutes. The recitation, Shinyanatiloka said, still not a complaint, but with the quality of something that had been waiting to be addressed and was tentatively offering itself. What about it? I am afraid of making an error. When is the recitation? Tomorrow morning. Is it morning now? No. Then, is the recitation here? A pause. The quality of a person locating themselves precisely. No, the novice said. It is not here. What is here? The dark, the forest sound, the air, the breath. This he seemed to reach for a word and settle for the most direct one, this. Only this, only this. Usilananda did not say anything further. There was nothing further to say. He sat, and the novice sat beside him, and the forest moved around them with the particular aliveness that forests have in the last minutes, before the birds fully commit to morning, everything present. Nothing announced. The whole world in the state of becoming that is also the only state it is ever truly in. After a time, 5 minutes or 15, Usilananda could not have said he became aware that the quality of the novice's breathing had changed. The slight irregularity of wakefulness, the small, shallow variations that come when a mind is active, had smoothed into something more, even more deep, more automatic. The body beside him had the particular quality of a body that has found its way to sleep, not collapsed, not unconscious in a heavy way, but released. The way a hand releases a stone it has been holding. The way a thought releases when attention moves past it. The way a breath releases into the exhale without requiring any decision from the one breathing. Shinyanatiloka was asleep. Usilananda sat for a while longer, watching the sky above the teak canopy begin its first actual lightening, the deep black beginning its very slow graduation toward the deep blue that preceded the grey, that preceded the light. The bird in the canopy made its sound again. Then another sound from a different direction. Then a third. Different species, different pitch. The forest's morning conversation starting in the way it always started, tentative. exploratory, each sound waiting to hear if the others confirmed that yes, it was time. He thought about nothing in particular. His hands remained in his lap. The breath moved. Each breath ended. The next arrived without being asked. This is the teaching that runs beneath all the other teachings, the one that is too simple to be dramatic, too available to be urgent, too close to require seeking. In the Burmese forest tradition, the masters returned to it again and again, not because it was complicated, but because it was the kind of simplicity that the complicated mind keeps overlooking. Everything that arises, bas. The breath that is here now is not the breath that was here a moment ago. The thought that fills the mind entirely in 1 second is gone the next. Nothing that has ever been present has failed to depart. Not one thought, not one moment of suffering, not 1 hour of wakefulness. Every single arising has been followed, without exception, by a passing. This is not a reason for grief. It is the nature of things, and the nature of things is the ground of peace. Because if everything passes, if the anxiety about tomorrow's recitation arises and then passes just as certainly as the breath arises and passes, then nothing has permanent residence. Nothing can stay and hold the house of the mind against its will forever. The recitation error and the worry about the recitation error and the memory of the previous error and the construction of the future error, these are all arising and passing, appearing for their moment and going. They come with urgency. They leave without warning. They feel solid, and then they are gone. The thought you are having right now will pass. The thought you are about to have has not yet arrived. Between the passing and the arriving, there is something that is not a thought, a space that is the breath, and the warmth, and the weight of the body, and the simple ongoing fact of being alive in this particular moment, which is the only moment there is. Do not try to hold it. It is already moving. Let it move. Do not try to stop the mind from producing what the mind produces. It will produce what it produces, and then it will pass. And then something else will arise, and that will pass too. There is nothing here that needs to be managed before sleep is permitted. The thoughts are not asking your permission to continue. They are arising and passing on their own schedule, the way the breath arises and passes on its own schedule, the way the night is passing on its own schedule into the morning that is already beginning somewhere at the edge of the sky. Feel the weight of the body now, the warmth, the breath. This breath arrives, stays briefly, passes. The next breath arrives, stays briefly, passes. There is no loss in the passing. The passing is what breath does. The passing is what thoughts do. The passing is what this entire night is doing, moving. Slowly, certainly, in its own time, from dark to light. The way every night moves, the way every moment moves, the way the teak forest around Usilananda's kuti moved through its own passing into a morning that it did not need to plan or decide or manage. The bird in the canopy makes its sound, then silence, then another sound from further away. Let the thoughts be what they are. Let the sounds be what they are. Let the body settle further into whatever holds it. The breath continues. The night continues, its long, slow passing. There is nothing to do. There is nowhere to arrive. The arriving and passing is the practice, and the practice is already happening on its own, in the body, in the breath, in the quiet, darkening and lightening of a world that has been doing this without interruption since long before any of us were here to notice it. Notice it anyway. The breath, the warmth, the weight, the sounds of the forest completing its night, the approaching light that is already present somewhere beyond what can yet be seen. Let it come. Let the thoughts arise and pass. Let the mind do what the mind does. Let the breath continue without your guidance. Let the body be held. Let this moment pass into the next, and the next, into the next, and the next. The night continues. The breath continues. You are already resting in what you have always been. Tonight, you have traveled far. You have sat in mountain hermitages in Korea, where a monk spent 24 years searching for something that had never left him. You have stood in a courtyard in Tang Dynasty China, where a weaver discovered that the gap she had been trying to fill was already full. You have climbed through bamboo forest in 13th century Vietnam beside an emperor who had given up everything he owned to find something that could not be owned. You have sat in the afternoon shade of a banyan grove in ancient India beside a woman who stopped governing her mind and found that the mind, ungoverned, was already peaceful. You have watched a yogi place his head in the mouth of what frightened him most and find it dissolve. You have stood in a monsoon downpour in northeastern Thailand and discovered that the rain was already warm. You have watched a winter cloud cross a high window in a mountain monastery in Japan and recognized, for a moment, the sky that you have always been. And you have sat in a Burmese teak forest in the last hour before dawn, watching breath arrive and depart, discovering that the passing is not a problem, that nothing that passes takes anything essential with it. These are 8 lives lived across 8 centuries and 7 traditions. These are 8 different languages, 8 different landscapes, 8 entirely different cultural contexts for the same arriving. But they are also one journey, the journey you have been on tonight, the journey from the thinking mind toward the ground beneath the thinking mind, from the weather toward the sky, from the wave toward the ocean that was always what the wave was made of. You did not need to go anywhere to make this journey. You have been lying still the whole time. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the whole teaching compressed into a single observation, that the journey toward peace has never required movement. The peace you have been traveling toward tonight has been present in the room the entire time, not hidden behind the stories, not waiting at the end of the 8th story, not scheduled to arrive after sufficient listening. Present. Here, in the breath that has been moving all this time without your supervision, in the warmth that has been holding the body all this time without your arrangement, in the awareness that has heard every word of every story tonight and is still here, unchanged, after all of them. This is what all these teachers were pointing at across their different centuries and their different mountains and their different ways of sitting in the dark. Not the same technique, not the same doctrine, not the same tradition, but the same recognition, arrived at from 8 different directions. The way 8 different rivers arrive at the same sea from 8 different headwaters, different in their color and temperature, and the particular sound they make over their particular stones, identical in what they are made of and where they are going. Jinul stopped building the House of Peace and recognized that he was already inside it. The weaver, Chengling, felt the gap in the weaving where the mind went quiet, and understood that the gap was not the absence of something. It was the presence of the ground. Tranyan Tong gave away his throne and climbed a mountain in bare feet and wrote a poem about eating when hungry and sleeping when tired, and found that this was enough. Ambapali watched her own aging without flinching and found peace not in what the body kept, but in the awareness that was present through all of its changes. Milarepa put his head in the mouth of the largest demon and found it empty. Brother Thomas stood in a warm rain and stopped fighting being wet. Ryokan watched a cloud move through a high window and recognized that the sky had never once been troubled by the weather passing through it. Shinyanatiloka let the thoughts arrive and pass like breath and fell asleep in a forest in the pre-dawn dark. You have been all of these people tonight. You have been the one searching, the one discovering, the one releasing, the one resting, and now you are the one for whom the stories have done what stories do when they are working properly, not taught you something new, but reminded you of something you have always known, something that goes deeper than knowledge, something that is already present in the body right now, in the weight of the limbs, in the automatic movement of the breath, in the warmth beneath the blanket that no one had to arrange. There is nothing more to understand. There is nothing more to achieve. The 8 journeys are complete, and they have all arrived at the same place here. This room, this body, this breath, this moment, which is already passing into the next moment, as gently and completely as every moment before it has passed. The traditions that carried these stories span 2,500 years, and a continent of landscape and culture. They are offered tonight as contemplative reflection, as ancient company in the dark, as wisdom that belongs to no single path, but to the long human recognition that peace is not constructed, but uncovered, not earned, but recognized, not arrived at, but remembered. You are already resting. The breath continues. If you do not remember the stories in the morning, let them go. They will have done what they came to do. The recognition does not live in the memory of the story. It lives in the body, in the breath, in the ground that has been here the whole time. Sleep now. The night holds you. The stories are done. The breath continues. Everything passes. Nothing essential is lost. If these stories have accompanied you tonight, please share them with someone else who might need company in the dark. It takes only a moment to reach someone who is lying awake. That simple act of care is itself a teaching, the kind that passes from one hand to another. The way peace has always traveled, quietly, from one human being to the next. Good night. You are enough. You have always been enough. Rest.